bonjour, good afternoon, Quay. Mon nom est Lise Langlois. Ça me fait plaisir de vous accueillir à ce symposium. Donc, distingués invités, chers participants et participantes, nous vous souhaitons la bienvenue. Tout d'abord, nous sommes situés en territoire autochtone, lequel n'a jamais été cédé et il reconnaît la nation Kanien'kehá:ka comme gardienne des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui. Totiaké, Montréal, est historiquement connu comme un lieu de rassemblement pour de nombreuses Premières Nations et aujourd'hui une population autochtone diversifiée ainsi que d'autres peuples y résident. C'est dans le respect des liens avec le passé, le présent et l'avenir que l'OBVIA reconnaît les relations continues entre les peuples autochtones et autres personnes de la communauté montréalaise. Nous sommes heureux de vous accueillir à l'occasion de ce colloque qui interroge les normativités de l'IA. Il est apparu important pour le comité scientifique de soulever des questionnements et d'explorer différentes perspectives avec les parties prenantes afin d'enrichir le débat et de penser autrement les différentes initiatives normatives entourant l'IA que l'on souhaite pour le bénéfice des individus, des groupes et de toute la société. Lorsque l'on pense, par exemple, aux automobiles et les réseaux routiers, les communications et l'Internet, il est important de se rappeler que ce ne sont pas simplement des systèmes techniques, mais ce sont aussi des processus sociaux, façonnés par le contexte social. Les technologies peuvent nous donner des moyens d'action, mais elles peuvent aussi incarner ou exprimer des relations de pouvoir et des caractéristiques culturelles existantes, renforcer des inégalités ou des pathologies sociales, ou manifester des objectifs idéologiques ou stratégiques. Ainsi, nos choix techniques définissent une réalité sociale au sein de laquelle émergent les alternatives souvent vues comme des buts et des objectifs à atteindre. Notre identité et nos rôles dans la société contemporaine sont fortement médiatisés par la technologie. C'est quelque chose que nous créons, mais qui nous recrée ou nous redéfinit également. Ainsi, une technologie n'est pas simplement un système de machines doté de certaines fonctions, mais plutôt l'expression d'un monde social. La question des normativités s'avère cruciale, car elle s'attarde à la question de la régulation des conduites, de même qu'au degré d'autonomie ou contrainte qu'elle exerce sur les conduites à adopter. Les questions de normativité sont traitées par des chemins et des moyens différents, que l'on parle d'éthique, de droit ou de déontologie, et ce, tant au niveau de la lettre que de l'esprit. La régulation liée au droit s'appuie sur des obligations à des normes, celle liée à la déontologie sur les devoirs et des règles, et celle liée à l'éthique sur une réflexion critique liée à ces normes et valeurs. Ainsi, les progrès technologiques façonnent de plus en plus le terrain moral sur lequel nous prenons nos décisions. Les choix que nous faisons en matière de technologie, en particulier lorsque nous n'évaluons pas pleinement leurs implications, peuvent donc être en contradiction avec nos objectifs, nos idéaux et les normes essentielles. C'est pourquoi, en tant qu'individus, familles, communautés et sociétés, nous devons réfléchir à la manière dont nous concevons et déployons les outils technologiques d'IA. Les conférenciers et conférencières viendront enrichir cette réflexion et présenter leurs travaux sur ce sujet d'importance dans le cadre de ce colloque international. C'est un premier rendez-vous, mais sûrement pas le dernier. Nous tenons à vous remercier, participantes et participantes, de vous être joints en si grand nombre à cette discussion. Nous serons plus de 160 personnes sur les 3 jours, un tour de force au retour de plusieurs années de pandémie, de confinement et d'échanges en virtuel, et qui démontre toute l'importance de ce rassemblement. Nous sommes particulièrement contents de retrouver les collègues et les étudiants parmi vous, mais nous sommes aussi très heureux d'accueillir de nombreux intervenants des ministères et organismes du Québec, notamment du ministère de la Cybersécurité et du Numérique, du ministère des Relations internationales, du ministère de la Justice, de la Santé ou encore du ministère de la Culture et bien d'autres. Nous sommes aussi très heureux d'accueillir des personnes qui œuvrent dans les organisations privées, dans des grandes entreprises et des PME du Québec. Enfin, nous sommes fiers de compter parmi vous plusieurs représentants de la société civile, des personnes du grand public, mais aussi des représentants d'organisations à but non lucratif, des représentants de communautés et de groupes. C'est cette diversité d'acteurs et ce dialogue intersectoriel qui est au fondement de l'OBVIA et de notre mission, celle d'identifier des enjeux sociétaux de l'IA et du numérique et de proposer des solutions en collaborant avec les communautés de pratique, la société civile et les décideurs publics. Enfin, je tiens à remercier ceux qui, sans cette activité, n'auraient pas pu voir le jour. Les fonds de recherche du Québec qui financent l'Observatoire, le Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines avec qui on a eu cette subvention, l'Institut de valorisation des données IVADO et en particulier Guillaume Chicoine, l'équipe de direction et les collègues en communication avec qui c'est toujours un grand plaisir de collaborer. La chaire de recherche sur les technologies et la nature humaine de Stephen Charolski de l'Université McGill, Algoralab, Université Laval, le réseau de la science et de l'innovation britannique et la chaire Wilson sur le droit des technologies de l'information et du commerce électronique de l'Université de Montréal. Je tiens à remercier les collègues du comité scientifique, Céline Casté-Renard de l'Université d'Ottawa, Marc-Antoine Dillac de l'Université de Montréal, Karine Gentelet de l'Université du Québec en Outaouais, Jocelyn Maclure de l'Université McGill et Alison Marchildon de l'Université de Sherbrooke. En terminant, je tiens à remercier ma précieuse équipe si dévouée des bénévoles à l'OBVIA, Guillaume, Nicolas, Félix, ainsi que les bénévoles Viviane, Michel, Marie-Françoise, Antoine et Virginie. Merci beaucoup. Je vous souhaite un bon colloque à tous. Et je vais présenter les prochains les prochaines personnes qui viendront vous dire quelques mots. J'inviterai en avant M. Pierre Dumonchel, directeur du transfert technologique chez IVADO, qui sera suivi de M. Éric Dequesne, sous-ministre adjoint aux Relations des Amériques, Affaires économiques et intelligence stratégique. Et en terminant avec Mme Chloé Adams, qui est la consul générale du Royaume-Uni à Montréal. Merci. Bon colloque.
Bonjour, mon nom est Pierre Dumouchel, je suis directeur transfert technologique chez IVADO. Et IVADO est un institut de recherche et de transfert de calibre mondial en IA. Et on existe depuis 6 ans. Et on est très fiers du parcours qu'on a fait à Montréal en IA. Notamment le développement de l'écosystème que nous avons en IA. Ce qui nous distingue de Toronto, de l'Alberta et des autres provinces en IA, à Montréal et au Québec, c'est le fait que l'IA, on a développé dans un contexte responsable aussi. Et IVADO est fier d'avoir contribué à ça. On a participé à la mise en place de la déclaration de Montréal pour une IA responsable. On a participé à la mise en place aussi de l'OBVIA, aussi de Scale AI, qui est une grappe en IA à Montréal. Et on a fait aussi nos propres activités en EDI. On était un des premiers centres de recherche à avoir une conseillère à temps plein en EDI. Et où on s'en va maintenant, IVADO? Bien, IVADO, on vient de proposer au gouvernement fédéral, dans le cadre d'une subvention apogée, une nouvelle IA, une IA qu'on va appeler IA-R3. IA-R3, en fait, c'est 3 R. Les 3 R sont pour une IA robuste. Si je prends l'analogie de ChatGPT, on sait bien que si on lui pose une question qui vient avec des données post-2021, mais il ne pourra pas résoudre. Il va fabuler, il va halluciner, comme on dit dans le jargon. Pourquoi? Parce qu'il était entraîné avec des données, il y a une distribution de données, et les données post-2021, c'est des données hors distribution, et ils fonctionnent mal dans ce contexte-là. L'humain, lui, arrive à fonctionner. Un humain, on lui apprend à conduire à droite, comme en Amérique, et il va pouvoir conduire à gauche, avec une certaine attention plus grande, dans un pays où on conduit à gauche. Pourquoi? Parce qu'il y a 2 systèmes d'intelligence l'humain. Il y a le système de niveau 1, comme ChatGPT utilise, qui est très rapide, qui accumule des centaines de données, des milliers, des milliards de données, je dirais même, et il va prendre une décision rapide. L'humain, lui, il va avoir un système 2 qui, lui, est plus lent, qui va raisonner, et ce que n'a pas les systèmes de IA actuels. Donc, on veut étudier cet aspect-là pour une IA robuste. L'intelligence artificielle actuelle ne raisonne pas. Hein, si on lui pose la question, Joseph a 2 enfants, dont un avec Marie. Marie a 3 enfants. Combien ensemble ils ont des enfants? Mais il ne pourra pas résoudre ces problèmes-là. Ou si on lui demande simplement de faire une addition de très grands chiffres, mais il ne l'aura pas vu dans ses données. Il ne pourra pas additionner ces très grands chiffres-là. Il va halluciner, il va proposer quelque chose d'autre. Donc, une IA responsable, raisonnante aussi, et finalement, une IA responsable. Parce que dans ce projet-là, qu'est-ce qu'on veut faire? C'est d'abaisser 2 barrières. La barrière technologique, mais il y a aussi la barrière de l'adoption. Et cette adoption-là est très importante. Et ce n'est pas simplement d'améliorer la technologie qui va faire en sorte qu'on va mieux l'adopter. C'est par des colloques qu'on a ici aujourd'hui, dans lesquels on va parler de normes, de règlements, de déontologie, d'éthique. Et nous encourageons ça, et Ivado sera toujours avec vous pour vous accompagner dans vos activités. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, Madame la Consul générale britannique à Montréal, Madame la directrice générale de l'Observatoire international sur les impacts sociétaux de l'intelligence artificielle et du numérique, Madame Langlois, Monsieur le directeur des transferts technologiques au sein d'Ivado, Monsieur Dumouchel. Mesdames et Messieurs, distingués invités, bonjour. Alors, je suis très heureux d'être ici aujourd'hui parmi vous, à la grande bibliothèque, dans cette enceinte magnifique, pour ouvrir ce colloque international ayant comme thématique « Société, intelligence artificielle et normativité ». Je suis ravi d'avoir l'occasion de rencontrer pour une première fois plusieurs d'entre vous qui êtes des partenaires de première importance pour le ministère des Relations internationales et de la francophonie et pour le gouvernement du Québec en entier. Cet événement est caractéristique du dynamisme québécois dans le domaine de l'intelligence artificielle, responsable à l'échelle internationale. C'est donc une grande fierté pour moi de voir tous ces experts internationaux venir ici au Québec afin de discuter d'enjeux cruciaux pour notre société et d'explorer différentes initiatives normatives entourant l'intelligence artificielle au bénéfice des individus et de toute la société. Le Québec promeut une gouvernance responsable de l'intelligence artificielle, et ce, depuis maintenant de nombreuses années. En effet, grâce à ses centres de recherche, ses universités et à son écosystème riche et diversifié, le Québec s'illustre comme un acteur clé autant en recherche qu'en matière d'éthique et de gouvernance. Véritable précurseur, le ministère des Relations internationales et de la francophonie, quant à lui, s'est impliqué dans la création d'une entité internationale œuvrant au développement éthique et responsable de l'IA, le Centre d'expertise internationale de Montréal en intelligence artificielle, que vous devez tous connaître sous le nom du CIEMIA. La métropole est ainsi devenue, aux côtés de Paris, l'hôte de l'un des 2 centres d'expertise du partenariat mondial sur l'intelligence artificielle. Nos équipes s'impliquent activement dans les discussions où se décide le futur de l'intelligence artificielle au sein de forums internationaux tels que ce colloque aujourd'hui. Chaque fois, nous nous efforçons de faire en sorte que l'expertise québécoise soit mise à contribution dans l'élaboration des principes et des pratiques exemplaires pour aider tous les acteurs du secteur à maximiser les impacts positifs de l'intelligence artificielle tout en minimisant ses impacts négatifs. À titre d'exemple, au début du mois, l'Université de Montréal accueillait une délégation du Centre en intelligence artificielle de l'Institut de technologie et d'études supérieures de Monterrey, au Mexique. Dans le cadre de leur visite, ces derniers souhaitaient s'inspirer des pratiques de délibération développées par l'équipe ayant élaboré la Déclaration de Montréal. Je salue par ailleurs M. Dilia, qui est ici présent. Je crois que vous êtes ici. Alors, je vous salue. Ce projet a été soutenu donc par le programme de coopération bilatérale Québec-Jalisco, coordonné par notre ministère. Enfin, je souhaite terminer en soulignant notre présence ici à la BANQ. La grande bibliothèque se veut un carrefour dynamique d'échanges et de rencontres qui favorise l'émulation et l'émergence d'idées novatrices. Ce lieu me semble donc l'endroit idéal pour tenir ce colloque, avec son programme à la fois riche et pertinent. Je vous souhaite des discussions donc stimulantes à la hauteur de vos ambitions. Merci et bon atelier.
Monsieur le sous-ministre adjoint, distingués invités, mesdames et messieurs, bonjour, good afternoon. C'est pour moi, en tant que consul général du Royaume-Uni à Montréal, un honneur et un plaisir de m'adresser à vous à l'occasion de l'ouverture officielle de ce colloque. Je voudrais profiter de l'occasion pour exprimer mes remerciements à toute l'équipe de l'Observatoire international sur les impacts sociaux de l'intelligence artificielle et du numérique, ou c'est long ça, ce nom, d'avoir organisé cet événement avec le soutien du gouvernement britannique et plus particulièrement le réseau des sciences et de l'innovation du Royaume-Uni. L'intelligence artificielle devient peu à peu omniprésente dans notre économie et notre société. Les progrès de l'IA et l'influence croissante des algorithmes sur nos vies est indéniable et continuera de croître à l'avenir. Outre leurs multiples avantages, ces technologies présentent également des risques et des défis liés à une utilisation malveillante ou à l'aggravation des inégalités et des clivages. La construction d'un modèle éthique de l'IA est plus que jamais un facteur clé de succès dans la coopération internationale et pour la protection des droits fondamentaux. You may have already tried out ChatGPT that was mentioned earlier, the AI-powered chatbot that has just shaken up the tech world. It had 1 million users in its first week of launch. Yet despite its initial success, poses certain challenges, including reliability, plagiarism, misinformation. As the tech industry races to increase adoption of this new technology on a global scale, there are potentially far-reaching social effects to consider. Perhaps more than anything, this creates a profound sense of responsibility for all of us and for those like you involved in the development and deployment of the technology itself. AI technologies have huge potential to power new firms and revolutionize old ones with improved productivity and creative ways of working. But we also need the tools to govern its development, ethics, and use, including through globally developed technical standards. 2023 will be a defining year for AI and in shaping the future of an ethical AI. And that's why it's so important that you are all here today. I can see the room is filled with international AI creative thinkers committed to developing AI that benefits our economies and our societies. Le Royaume-Uni, le Canada, le Québec sont des leaders mondiaux de l'IA, des partenaires naturels qui partagent les mêmes valeurs fondamentales en matière du développement et de l'adoption d'une IA responsable. Nous sommes intrinsèquement optimistes quant aux opportunités que l'IA offre à nos économies, nos citoyens, nos entreprises et nos sociétés, tout en étant clairs sur les défis et la nécessité de protéger nos citoyens et les industries de tout préjudice. Ensemble, nos deux pays peuvent guider la communauté internationale dans le développement responsable de l'IA. Je vous remercie de votre attention et vous souhaite un excellent colloque. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis Jocelyn Maclure, professeur de philosophie à l'Université McGill, titulaire de la chaire Jaroslawski sur la nature humaine et la technologie, qui est un des partenaires dans l'organisation de cet événement. Je suis aussi président de la Commission de l'éthique en sciences et en technologie du Québec. Le Québec a eu la sagesse d'instituer un organisme indépendant, mais permanent, qui doit entre autres conseiller le gouvernement en matière d'éthique des sciences et des technologies. I am accompanied by Alexis Morin-Martel, who's a second-year PhD student in philosophy at McGill, working in AI ethics. Okay, so this is a conference on different modes of regulation of AI technologies. I think that there's wide consensus that AI needs to be regulated, but regulation can take many different forms, from pure self-regulation by the developers to hard, positive legal norms backed up by sanctions and enforced by regulators. We can think of ethics charters or declarations. We can think of soft laws at the international levels. We can think about different social norms shaped by different actors in civil society. Many AI technologies are already disruptive or are likely to be even more so in the coming years. And even those of us who are skeptical about the grand claims made about AI's future development, even those who are skeptical think that actually existing AI technologies are creating many ethical problems, risks, and dilemmas. Just think about how ChatGPT is wreaking havoc in higher education right now. And when I talk about the grand claims, I talk about all those who think that the development of AI will be continuous and will pick up speed importantly in the years to come, and that at some point, say, artificial general intelligence will be reached, and that this could create even something like an existential risk for humankind. I'm quite skeptical of these grand claims or claims about AI consciousness and so on, but even if one is skeptical, AI as it exists today is creating many, many different ethical, political, legal, and social problems that we need to take seriously. And that's why we have this conference. It's quite fitting that we're having this international conference bringing philosophers and legal scholars and sociologists and computer scientists and policymakers and so on together here in Montreal. As it was mentioned, Montreal and Canada more generally contributed significantly to the rebirth of AI in general, and by extension, it contributed greatly also to the rebirth of AI ethics as a very dynamic academic field. As you all know, some of the deep learning pioneers are from Montreal or elsewhere in Canada. Montreal, Toronto, and in Alberta also you find many AI labs. And I think that the fact that we could interact with leading AI scholars, us in the humanities and social sciences and in philosophy and ethics in particular, that gave us kind of an edge to be well aware of the different limits and risks created by new AI technology. And this led to the Montreal Declaration, which was mentioned before, a declaration for the responsible development of AI, which was made public in 2018. I think that we'll hear about the declaration in Marc-Antoine Dilac's session tomorrow or on Thursday. That said, we should certainly not think that AI ethics was born circa 2017. That would be a gross epistemic injustice to those who were already there and going at it beforehand. So we can think of scholars in the 70s and 80s working in robot ethics or machine ethics or machine morality, moral machines, and so on. So it's an old field, but it looks like a new field because the AI world shifted to a new techno-scientific paradigm that we can associate with machine learning and artificial neural networks. And the shift from, say, good old-fashioned AI to machine learning created new ethical problems and tensions, and current-day AI ethicists are addressing these dilemmas and risks. We all know these issues and dilemmas by heart now, so issues related to explainability and opacity, to privacy, to fairness and the risk of discrimination. Problems related to accountability and so on. and also as a as engaged citizens, we cannot also not worry about how, say, recommendation algorithms used by different social media platforms create new obstacles for what philosophers call the public use of reason, right? It creates obstacles to this the realization of an ideal of an enlightened deliberative democracy. Okay, so in this first session, we'll start from the most high-level mode of regulation, that is ethics and ethical values. Can ethics, for instance, inspire new ways to design AI system? So that's a way to think about ethics, about how those who design the system can kind of encode the values or be ethical engineers and so on. Can ethics be more political and institutional and be geared toward the design of a new legislative framework and to new public policies to regulate the development of AI? As an academic subfield, are AI ethicists contributing significantly at the moment to the understanding of the ethical challenges that I mentioned before? Are we, as scholars, coming up with innovative solutions or responses to the explainability or discrimination problems? That's some of the questions that I'm asking my colleagues, and we'll hear from three very distinguished contributors to this bustling field of AI ethics. Okay, before giving the floor to Alexis, I need to say that there's simultaneous translation going on, so if you need, you can grab a headset above, and you need to show an ID in order to get one. And I also want to thank the Obvia team and Lise and Guillaume in particular, that there was a lot of work put into the organization of this conference, and also my colleagues in the scientific committee, so Alison, Céline, Marc-Antoine, and Karine. I hope I'm not forgetting anyone. Okay, so up to you, Alexis.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Before saying a few words about today's speaker, I just want to say also a few words about the Jaroslavsky Chair in Human Nature and Technology. So the chair founded by the Jaroslavsky Foundation was launched last year. It supports research on the impacts of technology on human beings and societies with a special focus on AI and digital technologies. It does so by contributing to the organization of events, such as this one, by supporting graduate students, such as myself, and hosting visiting scholars, fostering collaboration between different disciplines and between academics and other actors and stakeholders. So stay tuned. There are many more events upcoming organized by the Jaroslavsky Chair in the upcoming months and years to come. About today's schedule, as you might have noticed, there will be three presenters today. The first presenter would be Professor Annette Zimmermann, followed by Professor Vincent Müller, and then Professor Karina Vold will also be with us, unfortunately through Zoom, since she couldn't make it today for other obligations. There is a slight change in the schedule, so the pause will be after Professor Vincent Müller's presentation at 3:15. All right. Now, let me introduce today's first speaker. Annette Zimmermann is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a technology and human rights fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University. Professor Zimmermann's research interests cover a range of topics within the philosophy of AI and machine learning, political philosophy, moral philosophy, social and moral epistemology, philosophy of law, and philosophy of science. One of her main areas of research is exploring the impact of AI technology on existing structural injustice within our societies. Professor Zimmermann has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Oxford. Before welcoming her, one last detail that I forgot about is that each presenter will give a 35 minutes presentation, which will be followed by a 10-minute Q&A session. So hopefully you will enjoy these presentations. Thank you very much.
Bonjour, je suis très heureuse d'avoir l'opportunité de participer à cette conférence. Malheureusement, j'ai oublié tout mon français, so this talk will be in English. It's an honor and a pleasure to be participating in this very inspiring interdisciplinary conference today. Thank you so much to the organizers for having me. I'd like to talk today about the choice to build AI as an inherently political choice. I thought it might be helpful, just to start us off, to tell you a little bit about 3 recent, fairly big shifts in the interdisciplinary AI ethics community that I've observed over the past 12 to 18 months, perhaps, just looking at major interdisciplinary conferences in the field, such as FACT and AIES, but also recent publications that both philosophers, computer scientists, and empirical social scientists have come out with. I think the first biggest shift that we're seeing right now is this increasing focus on structures rather than just individual impact. So moving our perspective away from just a focus on individual harms that might arise in the context of kind of classic algorithmic fairness cases, and paying much closer attention to the interplay of algorithmic outputs with larger scale background structures of social injustice. Secondly, and in conjunction with that, we've recently seen much more of a focus on questions of how wealth and power are actually concentrated amongst oligopolistic actors within the technology industry, and that is a useful addition to existing discourse on the moral wrongs that go along with paradigmatic cases of algorithmic bias. So in this context, we've increasingly seen scholarly contributions to the moral and political implications of the gig work economy, as well as an increasing focus on labor unionizing in this sector. Finally, there's an increasing level of attention being paid to the question of non-deployment. So the question of whether there are some forms of AI and machine learning that should simply never be built and deployed at all. And that can be a competing strategy to existing optimization strategies, in the sense that in many cases, technology industry practitioners and academics will naturally be focused on this issue of, well, what can we do to make existing AI tools better? How can we optimize them on a technological level, as well as how can we optimize the social and political context in which we deploy them? And it's this latter question that I'd like to pay closer attention to during my talk today. To do so, I thought it might be helpful to look at a few recent interesting case studies. So right here on the top left, you can see an example that we'll just call our objective beauty case. Here, an AI-powered facial beauty assessment tool, for instance, the one that is screenshotted here, developed by a company called Quovis Studio, compares users' faces to a supposedly objective standard of beauty and offers recommendations for cosmetic surgery in conjunction with that assessment. Now, similar beauty assessment tools have been shown to reinforce racial inequality in a number of contexts by entrenching Eurocentric beauty standards that often just favor whiteness. So this kind of AI tool and other similar tools often scored white faces as just inherently more beautiful. Our second case is here at the bottom of our slide. This is a tone evaluation case. The screenshot here shows you Amazon's new health band called Halo. And this health band claims to be able to evaluate users' emotions by simply listening to users' tone of voice. Now, very interestingly, female users report receiving feedback from this health band, warning them that their tone sounds condescending and dismissive. And this raises an immediate ethical and political worry, given that there already exists a set of socially salient stereotypes concerning the tone of women's speech. Think, for instance, of the familiar trope that women tend to be hysterical, for instance. Feedback of this kind can simply reinforce those existing social stereotypes in a damaging way, because users who receive this feedback will evaluate that feedback
by explicitly referencing that social context that they're familiar with. Now, our third example is a case that some of you might have heard about. This was a very controversial and very highly covered case in this community. Let's call it the gay facial recognition case. So in the gay facial recognition case, we had a facial recognition system that was being used in order to predict the sexual orientation of a person, amongst other things. Now, the tool's creators, a team of Stanford researchers, also claim to be able to predict other characteristics, such as a person's propensity for violent criminality, all by just looking at the features of that person's face. Now, when the researcher who developed this tool was interviewed by The Guardian a few years back, he stated, "I was shocked it was so easy." Well, what does he mean by that? So he claims while humans accurately predicted features like sexual orientation in 61% of cases for facial data from men and 54% of cases for women, the researchers now claim that their tool actually performed accurately in 91% of cases for men and 83% of cases for women. Now, at first glance, you might just think, well, that sounds bad in some sense, but we actually don't have to use these tools ourselves if we don't want to. Right? So you might therefore think, well, at the end of the day, these are just weird AI tools solving weird problems, achieving kind of weird goals that are not strictly necessary and maybe not the most important ones. But I want to argue that this is not an innocent, simply weird problem. Which goals we choose to pursue when it comes to using automation really matters for a larger scale picture of social justice. All of these cases raise a really fundamental philosophical question to my mind. Even if these tools work reasonably well in the sense that they make accurate predictions, should some of them perhaps not be built in the first place? Now, this is a really controversial view. Many people, not just tech industry practitioners, think that there are really strong reasons not to actually stifle the development of innovative, powerful forms of AI and machine learning, because after all, AI can really help us perform many important and complex tasks that we as humans simply cannot accomplish at the same scale and speed. So this is an intuitive thought. And this much is true, right? So many forms of AI have positive potential, and not all forms of AI are inherently objectionable. So in short, there is a strong general presumption in favor of continuing to build, deploy, and incrementally optimize AI, a blanket presumption in favor of incremental optimization, so to speak, that applies across the board. So the idea is, even if AI is not perfect right now, we should try to make it better as much as we can in any given scenario in which we've already deployed. Now, that, the thought goes, will slowly help us get rid of the moral and political problems that often crop up in an AI context and lead to these paradigmatic cases of algorithmic injustice that have so captivated this community. But sometimes, I want to argue, the other strategy, not deploying and perhaps not even building in the first place, might be more just and better for society, all things considered. So in other words, there are important and, in my view, underappreciated reasons why we ought to question this blanket presumption in favor of incremental optimization in several cases. So the intuition here is it's not sufficient from the perspective of justice, if we construe justice in a plausibly demanding way, to ask whether a given tool is accurate enough. It's not all about accuracy. So whether the tool is doing what it's supposed to do doesn't answer all of our moral and political questions in this space. We also have to ask, well, what's the purpose of building a given tool in a given domain? And is that a good purpose? Could the pursuit of some purposes simply undermine justice, irrespective of how well that tool works? And if the goals and purposes underpinning a specific AI tool are unjust, should such a tool be built at all, irrespective of how much we can improve the tool over time? Now, it's very common both in the AI ethics community, but also in public discourse more generally, to explain algorithmic injustice via the so-called data as a social mirror thesis. The idea is very simple, garbage in, garbage out. So if we have bad data that incorporates or reflects existing social inequalities, our algorithmic outputs will simply replicate those. But things are not so simple. Data not only mirrors back structures of social injustice, it can also amplify those structures further, obfuscate them at the same time, and also make us more prone to automation bias. So it can automate our human and fallible biased ways of thinking, all while fooling us into believing that those biased AI outputs are actually the result of an inherently neutral and scientific process. Now, when we use AI and similar technologies, we can easily forget that actually we ourselves have to ask these really hard moral and political questions about what we really want to achieve in a given domain. It's easy to think that AI can solve these tricky problems for us, right? So we can be tempted to outsource some of that moral and political heavy lifting to automated tools. But the hard work of really thinking through the ethical and political stakes of using AI in a given domain really still falls on us. Now, it's important to appreciate the moral and political implications of this insight that technological systems necessarily interact dynamically with our complex social world, with our social systems, in the sense that they can amplify those systems. Now, technological systems, therefore, simply don't operate on their own in this moral and political vacuum, which immediately makes us, as decision makers, on the hook, morally and politically speaking. So in order to mitigate algorithmic injustice, we cannot ignore this larger social context in which AI is built and deployed when we try to optimize. So for these reasons, simply making things better on a technological level, for instance, by simply scaling up an accurate decision process that already has an unjust purpose, is not going to be good enough from the perspective of justice in many cases. To be more precise, if a social practice is already unjust or already morally objectionable, think, for instance, of the criminal justice process in many states, we should be very cautious about simply making that practice run more smoothly and accurately via really sophisticated technology. And we can see why this perspective is important when we reflect back to the three cases that we started with. So consider, for instance, the gay facial recognition case. The crux here is that the tool did this decision task purely by analyzing blunt image data of people's faces, right? So by measuring the distance between a person's facial features and by evaluating data about so-called gender atypical grooming styles. So this tool was met with significant academic and public backlash, right? Making this particular kind of inference, an inference from these blunt facial measurements to a prediction of a person's characteristics, so really far-reaching behavioral claims, far-reaching characteristics-based claims. It comes with significant historical baggage. In particular, in this context, critics asked, well, did this method of inferring these kinds of characteristics purely from this kind of data, from the data about the way a person looks, not echo discredited, racist, pseudoscientific methods and ideas like phrenology, physiognomy, and eugenics? Now, the background here is this: attempts to map out photographs of faces and to make far-reaching claims about associated desirable and undesirable personal characteristics on that basis were favored by eugenicists throughout history, like Francis Galton. Galton, in particular, tried and actually failed to use superimposed portraits of convicted criminals, of mentally ill people, of Jewish people, to create so-called composite images of various types of people, before moving on to what he considered the so-called healthy and talented social classes, which in his view included Anglican ministers, Westminster public school boys, and royal engineers. So using a similar type of inferential method really risks communicating and publicly reinforcing very similar harmful ideas propagated by eugenicists. The worry was that it's not only possible to look like a criminal or to look gay, but also that it's true that the way a person looks is an apt and accurate basis from which to make inferential judgments about their personal characteristics and future behaviors. So all in all, some AI tools may work fairly well across the board by the lights of their own success conditions for accuracy. So inaccuracy as such is not the central problem here, but their very use may be harmful if they rely on methods of inference that simply echo unjust historical practices. In such cases, building and using such tools itself may very well constitute what philosophers call expressive harm. So publicly communicating a demeaning and harmful message which takes on an unjust social meaning in light of prevalent historical and social norms, assumptions, and experiences. In all of these cases, it looks like it's not going to be enough to ask whether a given tool is accurate enough, whether it does what it's supposed to do, even though, of course, tech industry practitioners tend to really focus on exactly that question. If we have purely an accuracy mindset about AI optimization, we're going to ask questions like, can my AI tool predict if this person is gay? Right? This is going to be our focus. But if we adopt, in addition to that, the purpose mindset that I think we could and should adopt here, we'll ask, in addition to that, well, why do we want or need AI to predict that someone is gay to begin with, possibly without their knowledge and consent? How does predicting sexual orientation in this domain, or other features like it, actually help us move closer towards justice? And how could this effort undermine our aim to move closer towards justice? So that's the purpose mindset that competes with this accuracy mindset. So this brings us back to our two competing strategies, right? On the one hand, we have build, deploy, optimize over time. On the other hand, we have don't build, don't deploy at all. Now, again, the first strategy is appealing in many cases, right? So technologists, so the reasoning goes, can attempt to fix what is fixable in the short run. And that seems really plausible. We can fix bad technology. After all, fixing society at large by eradicating all forms of bias and injustice would be a much bigger, harder task. But it's not like the second strategy has been entirely unsuccessful. In recent years, multiple cities like San Francisco, via the 2019 Stop Secret Surveillance Ordinance, has decided to stop deploying facial recognition technology in particular in law enforcement due to its racially biased effects. And surprisingly, even private tech corporations agreed that non-deployment was the best solution in this particular case. Amazon, Microsoft, and IBM all issued voluntary non-deployment moratoria on themselves until the use of facial recognition technology in law enforcement was clearly regulated. Of course, it's likely that corporate endorsements of non-deployment strategies are primarily financially rather than ethically motivated, given the recent widespread and politically powerful protests against especially these kinds of deployment scenarios. May be a really effective way of actually just preventing a PR fallout while minimizing costs at the same time. Nevertheless, I think it's noteworthy that even tech industry practitioners who would ordinarily be the most persistent critics of non-deployment strategies have publicly advocated for the latter in at least some contexts. So the question now is, could non-deployment be a good justice-promoting idea in other cases? Is one strategy necessarily going to be better in all cases? Now, note that one actually need not be an innovation evangelist or anything to prefer optimization for all cases, even if we don't think that innovation is worth it just for the sake of innovation, that innovation is inherently valuable, so to speak. We might very well think that if we can lessen harms associated with the use of a tool that's already being deployed by developing a new and improved version of that tool, we simply morally ought to do so. Right? Non-deployment, by contrast, seems to amount to nothing more than giving up in a lot of scenarios, not even trying to solve problems like algorithmic bias arising in our current status quo, and deliberately refusing to use highly sophisticated technology that is available to us in order to fix these problems for the good of all. So the supposedly defeatist attitude underpinning non-deployment arguments seems particularly dangerous precisely because of the fact that we are often operating under significant uncertainty when it comes to AI, right? So uncertainty about how much we can optimize a given tool if we just try, uncertainty about exactly how such improvements will impact society at large, and uncertainty about whether a given tool might actually respond unpredictably to being deployed under a new set of empirical conditions. So this might be surprising to those who view algorithmic decision-making as the automated equivalent of a dedicated bureaucrat, right? A system that predictably and doggedly implements whatever principles its human developers force it to implement. In his path-breaking 1950 article, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, published in the philosophy journal Mind, Alan Turing very poignantly argued that the view that machines cannot give rise to surprises is due, I believe, to a fallacy to which philosophers and mathematicians are particularly subject. Machines take me by surprise with great frequency, end quote. Of course, such surprises include really positive surprises, right? So over the course of an optimization effort, we might well find that a given AI tool starts working remarkably well, that it is useful for solving highly complex decision tasks that humans would simply not be able to solve. Trial and error and accidents and surprises, therefore, have always been a necessary component of innovation. This much is indisputable, I think, right? So many socially beneficial scientific and technological advances are just unforeseeable and unplanned. But at the same time, efforts to build and optimize innovative new AI tools need not necessarily bank on fortuitous accidents, of course. More specifically, optimization need not always mean very risky deployment in the world at large on a massive scale. Often we can simply build new tools and cautiously deploy them under relatively controlled and constrained and testable conditions. Now, nonetheless, my view is that it's not plausible to think that one strategy is always better. There is no blanket solution because the right strategy on this view will always be responsive to the specific social context of an AI tool. So even though there is a plausible presumption in favor of optimization, there are several good reasons to resist the kind of blanket endorsement of optimization that is now common in the technology industry. Choosing not to build, deploy, and optimize does not necessarily mean making things worse. Indeed, it can move us closer to justice. So in other words, there's no universal normative principle that helps us resolve this question of how to make society more just. But here's the thing, and this may be surprising if you found this argument intuitive up until this point. My position is quite controversial, especially amongst industry practitioners. Why? Well, because radical optimization supporters, so those people who are very much against the idea of the do not build, do not deploy strategy, do think there's a blanket solution. Again, it's this idea that making things better in some deployment domain is always going to be a win. It's always going to be good. Now, often financial motives are behind this. Tech industry giants maintain market dominance, of course, by prioritizing speed over safety and ethics, by chasing the state of the art, by moving fast and breaking things. So in order to achieve or maintain market dominance, tech corporations must often build and deploy as many innovative AI tools as possible, as quickly as possible. It's possible to build a new tool, the reasoning goes, that suggests that one ought to build it, right? One should just go for it. Rather than asking, why should this technology exist? Why would we build this tool? Most technologists are much more likely to ask, well, why not? Let's try it. Meanwhile, many tech industry practitioners are increasingly worried about and actively working to counteract AI's potential ethically and politically harmful impact. So it's not the case that financial motives dictate all efforts in this area. Most major tech corporations now have designated teams focusing on ethical or trustworthy or responsible AI. And this, of course, is in and of itself a rather limited indicator of whether members of tech corporations are genuinely concerned about the moral and political stakes of AI, or instead predominantly concerned about issues of legal compliance and or strategic branding. In particular, the recent firing of the two co-leads of Google's ethical AI team, Dr. Timnit Gebru and Dr. Margaret Mitchell, reveals that industry AI ethics efforts can often be restricted and outweighed by competing corporate aims. But employees of major tech corporations are also increasingly organizing themselves bottom up, often against significant corporate backlash, with the aim of holding their employers accountable for potential harmful uses of AI. The Alphabet Workers Union's mission statement, for example, emphasizes that we will use our reclaimed power to control what we work on and how it is used. We are responsible for the technology that we bring into the world and recognize that its implications reach far beyond Alphabet. Now, it's worth noting here that while mission statements like the Alphabet Workers Unions are in principle compatible with both the optimization strategy and the non-deployment strategy, they typically do lean very heavily towards optimization, and specifically optimization within powerful corporate structures. As of August 2021, the Alphabet Workers Union's mission page stated that, quote, "We will work with those affected by our technology to ensure that it serves the public good. Alphabet can make money without doing evil." Now, under a section titled "Why We Organized," the union says, "Help us make Alphabet the best." So it's very much an optimization effort that is focused on remaining within these corporate structures. Statements like this reveal a common attitude in the technology industry, I think. The idea that continued technological optimization across various domains can and should benefit everyone, and that optimizing technology with justice-oriented aims in mind is perfectly reconcilable with the aim of corporate profit, concentrated primarily amongst a small number of very powerful private sector agents. Now, of course, finally, there are simply pragmatic motives that also favor optimization. Technological innovation, as we've seen before, has always required experimentation, surprises, and even accidents that ultimately help us advance. And for that reason, it's understandable that there's this widespread attitude of trying things out and tinkering with technology in order to try to fix it. But in what follows, I'd like to show you three arguments for why we should question this blanket endorsement of AI optimization. And I'd like to begin with an argument that we can simply call the bad goals argument. Right? So the thought is even AI tools without an explicitly bad purpose can end up enabling nefarious secondary uses. So seemingly apolitical AI applications can facilitate the political persecution of vulnerable groups at an unprecedented scale. Consider, for instance, McGill, the Chinese company that developed Face++, which is a tool that is similar to our earlier case from Chloe's studio. So again, this was a tool that provided a beauty score to its users. But this was not the only purpose for which McGill aimed to use its expertise in facial recognition technology. It then collaborated with Huawei to test a so-called Uyghur alarm, which was designed to recognize the members, or the faces of members of the persecuted Uyghur minority and immediately alert the police on that basis. So when nefarious purposes motivate efforts to build and optimize AI, we have really weighty moral and political reasons to counteract and critique these kinds of efforts. And of course, similar nefarious secondary uses can be imagined for Amazon's tone recognition technology and the other cases that we've discussed before. And of course, sometimes even the primary use of an AI tool can be objectionable for intrinsic reasons. For instance, as we've seen before, if it perpetuates harmful stereotypes. Relatedly, and this brings us to the second argument to resist this blanket endorsement of optimization, good guys simply don't always stop the bad guys. Here's a quote from one of the Stanford researchers who developed the gay facial recognition tools given to The Guardian. The researcher says, "I stumbled upon these results and I was actually close to putting them in a drawer and not publishing because I had a very good life without this paper being out, but then a colleague asked me if I would be able to look at myself in the mirror if one day a company or a government deployed a similar technique to hurt people." Of course, this argument relies on a really flawed logic because nothing prevents a bad actor from simply repurposing knowledge and capabilities gained from an AI tool first developed by a well-intentioned researcher. So we can have these trickle-down effects where the purpose is being shifted by a third party. Finally, I think it's important to appreciate that there are often no takebacks. So an earlier decision to automate a process can have irreversible effects on complex social systems. Now, optimization evangelists, so those who endorse optimization as a blanket strategy in a domain-unspecific way, may very well reason that all of these problems that we've discussed so far actually do not, in fact, undercut a blanket endorsement of optimization. After all, we always have the option of non-deployment. If at some point in the future it turns out that the original purpose of a given AI tool was objectionable or ill-defined, that it carried historical baggage, that it keeps interacting with and replicating an unjust social status quo, we can simply decide to stop using the tool then, at a later point in time. Now, the claim that non-deployment is usually a feasible option down the line is, sure, true in many cases. Recall the successful local bans on facial recognition tools and policing that I mentioned earlier. But it's not always true. Sometimes we cannot fully take back an earlier decision to deploy AI tools in a given domain. In some cases, an earlier decision to automate a given process can have irreversible effects on existing complex social systems. Suppose, for instance, that some company realizes that some task can be completed much more efficiently by an AI system than by a human employee, and therefore decides to automate that task. They decide to fire and replace all employees in charge of that task. Now, even if there is a backlash against that specific AI tool that the company uses to automate that task, and the company therefore decides to stop deploying that particular tool, it's not very likely that those who have lost their jobs due to automation will be rehired as a result. It's much, much more likely that that company will attempt to identify another way of automating that task in an efficient way. So automation in the labor market can be irreversible on a de facto level, even though non-deployment technically remains an option, because market actors have just no particularly strong market incentives to revise an earlier decision to deploy AI. In fact, there are often very strong incentives in the other direction. Given that being able to claim to rely on state-of-the-art powerful AI offers companies a major advantage over competitors, it's in their interest to increasingly create task-driven, low-paid, boring, precarious roles for human employees that invisibly support lucrative AI-driven products and services. Now, anthropologists Marielle Gray and computer scientist Siddharth Suri call these types of roles ghost work, the kind of unrecognized human labor that will become increasingly necessary the more we build and deploy AI. This can even go so far as companies pretending to have built and deployed AI while actually having human employees pose as an AI system to complete a given task. For example, in 2016, it became public knowledge that the personal assistant startup xAI was directing hundreds and hundreds of employees to pose as highly sophisticated superhuman AI chatbots, performing avalanches of incredibly mind-numbing repetitive tasks like generating natural-sounding auto-reply emails and scheduling calendar appointments. So this kind of fake-it-till-you-make-it approach is really popular among startups, of course, because it's a really low-cost way of testing out how the market responds to their services before actually having to build and deploy, right? Especially when it comes to deploying complex and expensive AI tools. It would be really misguided to hope that once such tools are actually built and deployed, the restructured workforce would simply revert back to its pre-ghost work structure. Now, of course, building, optimizing, and deploying AI is usually not an all or nothing decision. There's often a middle ground between not using a given tool at all and using it everywhere all at once. It seems reasonable to argue, for example, that when we anticipate that using AI in a specific decision domain risks bringing about unjust or otherwise bad outcomes, we could stop deploying it in the world at large while continuing to do academic research on it in a very secure, controlled environment. Unfortunately, again, things are not so simple. As the example of Duke MTMC, a data set of videos recorded in public spaces on Duke University's campus demonstrates. So this data set was made publicly available without data protections for the people who were being recorded here, and used for very controversial research on computer vision-based surveillance technology. And in response to very major public criticism, this data set was taken down in June 2019. However, as a team of Princeton University researchers has recently argued, at least 135 research papers ended up utilizing exactly that data set after it had been taken down, as well as derived data sets that even continue to be publicly available. So even if we build and optimize AI tools for research purposes only, it's not necessarily true that doing so will have no morally and politically harmful effects on society. When unethically collected data can potentially be used for research on how best to accelerate objectionable social practices, the mere fact that it's only a limited number of people who have meaningful access to that data, that's not going to be a sufficiently strong safeguard against the risk of harm associated with that kind of tool. So for these three reasons, the choice to build or not to build becomes an inherently political choice. Thinking hard about the purpose and goals associated with a specific AI tool and how those purposes and goals are actually going to interact with the messy complexity of our social world is going to be really, really important, and more important, in fact, than AI optimization as such. I want to argue that only if we do this can we actually decide which one of the two strategies we should adopt in a given deployment scenario, in a given domain. If making society more just is actually what we ultimately care about, if that is the primary normative value that we aspire to. As I've argued today, settling the question of whether a given AI system should be built and optimized or not built and not deployed at all will have to require careful attention to the socio-political context in which technology operates in each case. Right? So there is not going to be a blanket solution. There is not going to be a universal normative principle. This, however, doesn't mean that a series of just one-off context-specific non-deployment victories, such as the very localized facial recognition bans and self-imposed corporate moratoria, are going to settle the issue conclusively. So we shouldn't take away the message that domain specificity should inspire piecemeal and localized regulation. Industry-wide regulation in these really high-stakes AI deployment domains, including, but of course not limited to, policing and criminal justice, are likely to come more and more. And that would be preferable to one-off non-deployment decisions made by a very narrow, democratically unaccountable group of technologists, of course. But democratically legitimate regulation will require an even deeper shift, I think. So that's all of us who are affected by the use of AI, need meaningful opportunities to actually deliberate and argue about the question of, and if so, why, building, deploying, and optimizing AI in a specific area of public or private life will in fact serve a sufficiently demanding idea of justice. And that, of course, is going to be an inherently political question. So in other words, getting clear on the value and purpose of AI first is going to be more morally and politically important than the rush to make it better. Right, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Bonjour, hi. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. My name is Luke Stark. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western University in London, Ontario. And I agree with almost everything you said, but I have a question about the nature of evidence that might be applicable to some of these conversations, right? So physiognomy doesn't work. right? Physiognomy axiomatically is impossible. And the claim that Michael Kaczynski, I'm going to name him because I think he deserves to be named as a bad actor, is making in these various papers, not just about sexual orientation, but also about political orientation and other things, right? Is that the kind of, the conjectural judgments that individuals make on a daily basis in all sorts of kind of complicated ways can be scaled up, right? So I happen to think, right, that at a conceptual level, you can make an argument that kind of scaling up of that kind of conjecture is never applicable, right? But so I wonder, how do you incorporate these kind of epistemological questions, these questions about the theory of knowledge and what kind of knowledge is relevant into this theory? Because I think what I can imagine somebody saying to you is, oh, but if it works, then, that's the way the world is. That's the natural order of things, and we are showing the natural order. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. It's a big question. I don't want to put you on the spot.
Thank you. And this is a good example of this conference bringing together people who have tweeted at each other before. I'm delighted to meet you in person.
Same.
You're totally right that people do raise this question, right? So it could just be that even if there is this expressive harm in the sense that this tool seems very similar to these pseudoscientific historical practices, we could still have this competing normative concern of achieving good outcomes, right? Bringing about better consequences, and accuracy might just be a really core part of that. In that case, I would argue, we're actually playing a different game, right? So for the purposes of this talk, the assumption was justice is the core guiding principle for liberal democratic states. We might contest that, right? So you could be a hardline consequentialist. You could be a technocrat. You could just think, well, actually, justice is kind of pro tanto important, but it's not going to, all things considered, override our normative concern for bringing about good outcomes. If that's the case, that's a classic consequentialist line of reasoning that I happen to disagree with on the basis that my background normative judgments would differ. I think it's worth doubling down on this core value of justice. If we don't, I think we lose something really integral to liberal democracies. So the cost of making that argument would actually be much bigger than defenders of that line of argument might suppose.
Right, yes, that's great, thank you.
Thank you. Guillaume Bergeron, I'm with the Cybersecurity and Digital Department for the Quebec government. You talk about non-deployment being an option. I'm thinking about from a perspective of public service. Let's say I have a department or want to use, I'm going to use AI for this specific service. And like you said, there's a question being asked, is it going to be useful? So the first question, if kind of a rule zero, because we like to have government, rules or guide or regulation. The rule zero could be: do you need AI? Or for those here in Quebec, en as-tu vraiment besoin? As a popular TV animator often said. So is it an option? I mean, instead of just saying non-deployment, do you need specifically AI for a certain type of service? Could your service be used or be deployed without having AI? Does it reach its goal without using AI specifically in a digital service?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting question. There are many different layers to non-deployment, right? So it's actually helpful to build on this argument that we've just covered by expanding our lens from this dichotomy that we've posited before, so these two very clearly contrastable strategies, and think of it more as a spectrum in the sense that non-deployment could mean just very sandboxed, very controlled deployment for testing purposes, or it could mean, and I think this is a very exciting approach, using AI as a diagnostic tool rather than a decision-making tool. So this is another interesting and recent shift that has been going on in the AI ethics community, particularly amongst computer scientists and statisticians, I think, where the thought is, well, rather than trying to fix our social problems
by defaulting entirely to using AI? What if we deliberately deployed AI as a tool to identify much more precisely at which junctures of a decision sequence bias might arise? And so this is a very different way of thinking about deployment. Now we're not, for instance, a government actor who decides to determine criminal recidivism risk scores purely by using AI. We're now deploying AI as a heuristic device in order to make our own decision processes better, but we still empower existing democratically accountable actors to make final decisions. So that could be a really good way of thinking about this problem, particularly when it comes to public agencies that obviously are under much more stringent moral and political obligations to make really accountable decisions. Right? So there could be a middle ground here in which we favor the heuristic insights of AI rather than just defaulting entirely to it.
So there's this whole spectrum instead of just yes or no. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your talk. Really enjoyed especially the mindset of being purpose-focused. I had a question on sort of the longer term of AI. What are your thoughts on labs like OpenAI and DeepMind racing towards AGI? Maybe still a while away, but would AGI be a classic case of thinking you want to start with purpose versus optimizing? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Can you repeat the last sentence? That was a little too quick for me.
Sorry. What are your thoughts on so OpenAI and DeepMind racing towards artificial general intelligence? Regardless of what your timeframes are on that, would AGI be considered one of those technologies that you'd absolutely want to start with a purpose mindset versus just optimizing, keep racing towards it?
Yeah, in general, I think the purpose mindset is going to be prior to the accuracy mindset, and that does apply across the board. So that's a higher order normative principle that applies generally, whereas the actual decision to deploy or not deploy is going to be domain specific. So no matter what type of AI tool we're looking at, that purpose mindset has to be present first. I think OpenAI is very interesting as an example of an actor in the space that has very clearly articulated ethical motives around the decision to deploy in a very constrained and careful way. So thinking back, for instance, to the summer of 2020 and the very controlled deployment of GPT-3, where the company line at the time was, hey, listen, this tool is just way too dangerous to deploy at scale. And so what happened was that researchers had to apply to OpenAI in order to obtain access to this tool. Now, of course, with ChatGPT, the game has shifted, but even 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there was this very public statement from OpenAI that actually rocked the industry a little bit, where it was just conveyed to the public. We're not confident that we can control what people might do with this tool. So that was a very interesting example of corporate actors actually doubling down on the more cautious deployment side.
Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Vincent C. Müller, who is an Alexander von Humboldt professor for philosophy and ethics of AI and director of the Center for Philosophy and AI Research at Friedrich-Alexander-Universität in Germany, and he's also a Turing Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute in London. He worked in many universities in different countries, in Greece, in the Netherlands, in the UK. He is mainly concerned with philosophical problems connected to AI, both in practical philosophy and in theoretical philosophy. He edits the Oxford Handbook of the Philosophy of AI. He wrote a very useful entry of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on ethics of AI and robotics. And he has 2 books forthcoming, one with Oxford University Press, Can Machines Think? My own answer is no. As well as a book with Cambridge University Press on artificial minds. Vincent, the floor is yours.
Okay, good. Thanks. Thanks also to Professor Zimmermann for her talk. I think it's good because it's quite closely connected to what I'm planning to do. I'm sort of planning to do a bit of the dirty theoretical work behind the work that she was presenting here, so perhaps there's a link between the two. So here's the outline of what I'm planning to do. I'll talk a little bit about my motivation of today's talk. I'll do a little bit of a loop through some theories that are standard on decision theory, on ethics, then I'll make a little presentation on what kind of ethics I think is relevant for our field, and then I try to use it a little bit to show you that this actually works. So I'm starting with a negative component. Since nobody of industry or government is listening, it's just between us. We can have a look. Things aren't all that great. I mean, I think there's a weird phenomenon going on in recent years. Namely, I would say that there's a big demand for AI ethics. So lots of societal actors say we want to do that. We do want to take care of this technology before it really gets out of hand. And we want you to tell us what's going on and where this is going and what we should be doing, which is great, right? And you know, I've been saying this for 20 years, and people were saying, well, what is this? Who cares? And now everybody says, you know, yes, we want that, which is excellent. The bad news is we don't really know what we will say. So in terms of policy, I think there's very little good ideas on what policy should look like. The European Commission is probably the closest to reasonable policy at this point, with very significant effort in this direction. And still it's probably quite problematic, and a lot of other things, GPay, for example, I've been involved in, are less than successful. And also we don't really have a good picture of what the problems are or what the methods are to deal with these problems. So we saw in the previous talk a fairly sort of a fundamental view on what methods should look like, right? So, and I've said that in the survey that I wrote, as you mentioned, not that long ago, and in Floridi's forthcoming book, you can see basically the same things. There are a couple of items where we think there are issues there, but we don't really have like a neat theoretical structure where you can say, these are the major issues in the field. We think the fundamental issues are this, this, and this is how to deal with them. So I think there are two reasons for this situation. And the one is prognosis, and the other one is theory. So we don't really have the right ethics for AI yet because we don't really know what it's going to be like. I think that's a major problem. We're trying to make an ethics for a technology that is under development, and we're traditionally not very good at that. I'm pretty sure that when cars came about, people were thinking about what will this will do. I've actually read a nice article from, I think, 1912 or something like that, where people were discussing this and were saying this is going to be horrible. You won't be able to sleep at night, and you won't be able to let your children out in the street for fear of being killed, which was true, right? But the thing they didn't think about was the major impact that cars would have on our landscapes and our cities, right? They've completely changed the face of the earth because we changed it. As a result, just imagine that you would have Montreal without catering for cars. What would that look like? It would be a completely different thing, right, from what we have now. So predictions aren't very good. Another small anecdote about this. My son was 15, now has a very nice high-tech electronic books in his school. And he told me that from next month onwards, they're going to ban the use of those books. And I said, wait, didn't we just introduce them? And you're using them in class and so on. This is how you have the books now? Yes, he said, but they didn't like what happened in the classroom. So imagine what happens in a classroom if you give all the 15-year-olds a tablet computer with internet access and the textbook on it. Will they look at the textbook? No, right? Maybe 2% of the class, right? So they found out that the pupils were texting with each other and doing whatever, right? And so the whole thing collapsed basically right there. Yes, electronic textbooks are great, but you can't use them in class now. So minor issues. So prediction, I think, is a major difficulty in this sphere, and this will continue to be the case. So I'm taking a little bit of a breath now and seeing a bit of standard decision theory and ethics, and then why this is useful. So a classic account of intelligence, because we're talking about AI here, what is the I in the AI, is that being intelligent has to do with something like being able to pursue goals successfully. So when you say that was intelligent of her, you say that was intelligent of her respective with what she was trying to achieve. Okay, so you can't judge whether some action is intelligent or not without knowing what it is for, what the goal is. Roughly, therefore, intelligence is this ability to pursue your goals successfully, and particularly successfully in a wide range of environments. Every engineer knows that it's really easy to have a system that does something in a very specific environment, fully controlled, but then if you take it out of that environment, it becomes more difficult, and if you take it out in the real world, so to speak, it becomes more and more difficult. So that's roughly an idea. So the notion of goals is what I want you to keep in mind here. And that's related to the second bit, which is classical decision theory. So the classical theory is that humans should be rational agents. So we should be doing the kinds of things which we think are the best thing to do. So what's the best thing to do? The best thing to do is you think about all the options you have, what you could be doing, you evaluate these options, and you evaluate the options according to what the outcomes of the various things are that you could do, okay? So you can think of it like a menu, or you moves in chess are the classic example, right? You can have a number of possible moves. Which one is the best move? The best move is the one that produces the best advantage for you compared to your opponent, right? So you try to predict what's going to happen in the future. So problem is, of course, that in real life cases, you miss information on what is actually going to happen, right? So even if you have a really simple case like in a restaurant menu where you have a certain set of things you can choose from, you don't really know what you're actually going to get. And you don't really know other factors that might play into the game. And maybe the person you're sitting there with is a vegetarian and hates you from that moment onwards because you order pork chops, and you didn't expect that, and that might be really important in your life. So you don't really know what's going to happen. So real life action selection has to do not with utility, but with expected utility. Okay? So the idea of classical decision theory is that what a human should be doing is that they should maximize expected utility. Utility is what you think is best. Okay? And so this is traditionally thought of as being completely separate from ethics. This is just trying to get the best utility for me. Okay? That's classical decision theory. Of course, people have used this specifically in economics for a while at least, for predicting what humans are going to do and explaining human behavior. And what happened? Didn't work, right? Because humans don't behave rationally according to that. There's lots of reasons why they don't. They get lots of things wrong, and they have lots of biases and all sorts of things. And they don't behave as egoistically as people think that they should, and so on. It's a lot more complex than people thought. Okay, so the next bit, so we have decision theory. Now the next bit is the ethics. Apologies to the philosophers in the room. Essentially, interestingly, the word ethics, ethos, and the word mores in Latin, come from the same source. It basically means the habits, what people do, which I'm sure you've heard your mother say, right? Why shouldn't I do that? People do. This is not the way it's done. One doesn't do this kind of a thing. That's supposed to be an argument, okay? So it's a fairly common thing. So ethics has to do with what people do, and then we reflect on that, and we might actually, of course, improve what people do, right? Because we might have been doing something in the past and now we think that was a bad idea, right? So we should change what people have done. And hopefully that existed. That's called moral progress. Okay, so one elementary component of this, of ethics, therefore, seems to be that it is normative. So this is a very basic distinction. Statements are often either normative or descriptive, so they either say the world is like this, that's descriptive, or the world should be like this. This is normative. We will discuss the relationship between normative and ethical in a second, but roughly, so the bits on the right are normative, and you would expect someone to do something. So I could say the second thing there to a student, for example, right? An academic paper should have references. Your paper doesn't have any references, so it's not a good academic paper. Go back, right? Do that again. Okay, that's normative. That's the way we do it around here. Remember the mom argument, right? It's the same kind of structure. That's the way we do it. Notice the nice quote there from David Hume, who said that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. So the passions being the kind of thing that you're aiming for, your targets, okay? And reason should be, not only reason is, but also reason should be the slave of that. Okay? This results in the classical ethical theories. Essentially, you can judge actions in roughly three different ways: by what kind of a person you are, so for example, whether you're honest or not, the kind of actions you perform, and the kind of consequences you have. And usually the ethical problems the dilemmas that exist have to do with the fact that you might have one judgment in the one case, but another in the other case. So for example, you might say, lying is bad. Yes, but if by lying you can achieve a positive outcome, then you might consider that lying is good. So you have a tension between those two cases, right? And most ethicists are not rigid about this. In other words, most think that there are cases where a very important outcome can overrule a principle like lying is bad. Immanuel Kant being the notable exception to that, right? He thinks lying is always wrong. Okay, so now comes the minimal ethics. I'll tell you a little story of how I got to that idea. It has to do with my previous employment at TUE in Eindhoven. And so at that university, I was asked to participate in the structuring of an AI master program. Oh, I thought, very good. They want a philosopher on that program. Excellent. I'll go and participate in that. And so what they had in mind was that, yeah, okay, we'll teach these guys the AI and so on. You'll have nothing to do with that. And then we also have an ethics module somewhere, which we sort of latch on to the real science. Okay? I'm sure the philosophers in the room have heard this kind of suggestions. I was a little bit, I was sympathetic with this idea, but on the other hand, taken aback. I didn't want that idea that there is a kind of a thing which you latch onto. The thing, in fact, originally the proposal was that this would be optional. And I thought, well, who's going to do that, right? Because we can learn something real as opposed to doing some ethics. So, yeah. So we were discussing the other people who were going to teach in this master and I, what the function of the whole thing might be. And what is this ethics thing anyway? Obviously, which they asked me. And I suggested, well, it's really just a reflection on what's right and wrong. And it's really not all that different to what you do, because you would also say things like, don't use a biased data set because you'll get bad results if you do that, right? Or don't use this algorithm because it's going to take way too long, right? It might work, but it will take ages to run. So don't use it. Do something like this. That's a normative remark, right? You should not use this algorithm is a normative remark. So really, I said, what you're doing and what I'm doing isn't all that different. It's always a good trick, right? If you want to become part of a group and you explain that you're actually already part of the group. So I suggested that what you do and what I do isn't all that different because we're both doing normative things. So really, I suggested what we're all doing is we're trying to produce good engineers. So I suggested that would be what I want to do to teach the class on. What's good engineering? In the end, to my surprise, they decided that the whole masters would have the slogan of producing good engineers, and that all the classes were supposed to explain how they become good engineers by taking that class. Great, I thought. I was really surprised about this success because these colleagues, the technical colleagues, actually took on board my suggestion and said, yes, what you're doing is very similar to what we're doing. We're also doing normative stuff to some extent. So I thought, perhaps that's a good way to explain to them what ethics is about. It is really the reflection on normative concerns, and these aren't very different from the normative concerns you already have. So this is, of course, the philosophers will have noticed that, completely unorthodox. This is not the way it's supposed to be. The way it's supposed to be is, like Immanuel Kant here on the left suggested, is that you have a certain set of things that you think about. So Immanuel Kant says, the subject of ethics is, was kann ich tun? So in other words, what should I do? And as anybody who's been teaching an introductory class to ethics, and you have the problem, okay, they say, student says, what should I do? Like, which of the what should I do questions are the ethical ones? Right, so here I have on the right-hand side, there's supposed to be two pictures on here, where you can see it. The black to move one is obviously chess. What should I do? In other words, which move should I make? Don't think about that too much. You have a philosophy talk to listen to, okay? And the other one is supposed to illustrate two football players, football in the European sense of the word, where one person is thinking, what should I do? Should I try to score or should I pass and let the other person try to score? That's a what should I do question, okay? So for Kant and traditional ethics, these aren't ethical questions. These are just questions which Kant calls hypothetical imperatives. That is, if I want to win the game, should I then pass the ball to the other person? For example, are they better positioned to score or should I not? Right? So it's only under this hypothesis that, which is correct, it seems to me. Whereas ethics is dealing with categorical imperatives, which are things like don't lie or keep your promises. And that's not like keep your promises, comma, if you want to have other people trust you. No, it's keep your promises, period. Okay? Even if it produces bad consequences, you're supposed to keep your promise. That's the point of ethics. So I'm suggesting that we shouldn't really make that distinction. I find it really hard to make that distinction. So imagine the two football players, and the one decides not to pass to the other player and decides to have a goal, shoot at the goal, doesn't score, goalkeeper catches it. What is the other guy going to say? Yeah, you should have passed. You're an idiot. What were you doing? Egoistic, right? I was in a much better position than you were. Ethical remark, okay? They would say that was wrong. We're trying to win here. And what did you do? You egoistically thought that you wanted to be the goal scorer. No, but you were a team. It's called a team sport, right? So try to distinguish that. If I played chess, I might think of the best move. But if I play chess with my nephew, who is 7, do I think of the best move? No. I'm not trying to crush the 7-year-old. That's not the point, right? I'm trying to think, okay, what obviously intuitively my brain is probably going to think of the best move, right? But I'll probably try to think of ways so that he has a chance to participate in the game. The point, of course, is to have fun with a 7-year-old and to maybe he will enjoy chess, right? So what's the best move depends on the goals you have. In this case, inciting somebody to play chess and enjoy them. So it depends on the framing of the question. Okay, and that's something that humans can do. We can say, what's the best thing to do now? But we can change the frame. And I don't know, if an earthquake starts, not very likely, I think, in Montreal, but anyway, the framing would change, right? The best thing to do would be to run out, not to start to continue my talk and you to continue listening. That would be stupid, right? You should run off if there's an earthquake starting. That's the way to do it. So you try to think what is the right thing to do given the goals you have and the frame you have. So one way to think about this I'm not sure that works, is classical distinction between thick and thin ethical concepts. It's a bit surprising, but that's the way it is. So thin ones are the classical ones of ethics where you just say right and wrong, good and bad, evil, and so on, right? So which basically have a religious undertone, it seems to me. And the thick ones are the ones where you actually use a term and you actually imply a description in the term, right? So you say about someone that they're courageous as opposed to being good. They're good in a very specific way, right? Or dishonest or something like that. You don't just say that was bad. You say that was dishonest. It could still be good, right? But it was dishonest anyway. So I think that the thick ones are obviously a lot more telling, and people in virtue ethics have made quite a lot of that idea. So it seems that perhaps this is a good way to frame what I mean by normative as opposed to just saying right and wrong. So one way of thinking about this is through the concept of metacognition, which is something I became quite fond of recently. So this is the following idea. And the chess example perhaps explains this to you. So you might be thinking about something, and while you're doing this, you might be thinking on a secondary level, should I be thinking about this now? So maybe you are now thinking about what you are going to have for dinner and how to prepare it. Should you be thinking about this? No, there's a more important thing going on now. You should not be thinking about your dinner. You should. So you reflect about your reflection. Philosophers, I'm sure, have this a lot, right? I mean, sometimes we don't even get off the ground because we sort of reflect on our reflections, and maybe we reflect another level further up and why we should be reflecting and so on. And the result is that we can't do really basic things in life. But that's a question of metacognition, right? So the question is, should I be thinking about this or should I just act, for example? Right? At some point, for instance, I have to stop thinking what to have for dinner and make something for dinner, because if I just continue thinking, there won't be any dinner happening, okay? So also at some point I need to think, do I want to spend more resources on this? That's something that computer scientists, of course, know really well, right? You have to think about how many resources are you going to spend on the solving of this problem, because if the problem is how do I turn right or turn left on the next junction, and it takes an hour to think about this, then it's a bad program. Right? That can't work. You can't spend that many resources on something. And one way of metacognition is to think about what you're doing normatively. So is what I'm doing currently normatively a good idea? So normally I will just play chess, meaning I will just think which is the best move and I'll just go on doing this. But perhaps I might think, oh, wait, maybe that's not the important thing now. Normatively, right? So I go up one level and think, evaluating what I should do. And of course, that is what we should do in ethics. But not all the time, right? If we do it all the time, we get nothing done. So we have to have some goals that we pursue, and occasionally we have to sort of step out of that and think, are these really the goals that I should be pursuing? The tricky bit, of course, is when to do this, right? So there's an interesting theory on what to do. So what I need, in other words, is rational choice with normative cognition and normative metacognition, where I think about which are the right rational choices. So that is what I think is missing in the classical decision theory. So the classical decision theory is what I call instrumental intelligence. It's just saying, I'm trying to achieve this goal, and for this goal, I'm trying to have the best solution, period. Okay? That is the kind of thing that an AI researcher immediately recognizes. Right? We do that thing. We have a goal. We try to optimize for that goal. Off we go. Okay, in a sense, that's what you said right in your talk now. Occasionally, we have to do something else. We have to think about, is that what we should be doing? Should I be optimizing for that goal? Or should I perhaps be optimizing for a different goal? Is facial recognition the most important thing here? No, probably not, right? If you think about the uses of facial recognition in all sorts of places. So what I'm trying to say here is that this is part of rational choice, properly speaking. The version 1 in the decision theory is really an impoverished version of what rational choice is. Rational choice does involve thinking about what your goals should be. and not just taking your goals the way they are and just going forward. Okay. I think I'll skip this part and give you a little example of bias where that might work. So I love that little comic there on the bottom left, which is, I think, a nice way to sort of, somebody interprets what they see. And the second case say, oh, wow, girls suck at maths. So just taking one particular feature of the person you're speaking to and making that into a prejudice, okay? So there's been quite a lot of talk about AI systems being biased in this way. AI systems, either replicating bias that's already in the data or in the society, sometimes called historical bias, or even producing their own bias. So typically, bias then means that the system makes decisions based on a characteristic that's actually irrelevant to the outcome, right? So in this case, the decision might be, oh, you're likely not good at maths because you're female. Actually, being male or female is irrelevant to the question, but because you have this bias, you might produce that, okay? So being female or not being female, of course, is not irrelevant to all questions, right? It is very relevant to a lot of questions, but it's not relevant to the maths question, okay? So bias is for a specific issue at stake. So, yeah, there are lots of biases here. I've already mentioned a couple of those. So when you think about this, I used to think, well, maybe that's not really an ethical problem, right? There are plenty of biases like that. I like the prediction bias because it's so common in academia. The prediction bias is if you ask people how long are you going to take to do this, ask yourself or ask a student, how long are you going to take to write this paper? A student comes back and says, yeah, 3 weeks. It's going to be fine. How long is a student going to take? 2 months or so, right? And the amazing thing is, ask the professor how long they're going to take after 40 years of experience in the field, 3 weeks, and they're going to take 2 months, right? Everybody's organized conferences and so on knows this thing. Panic. Oh my God, last moment, and so on, right? So this doesn't seem to improve very much. It improves somewhat, but not very much with experience, which is crazy. So that's why it's a nice bias. And it also never goes the other way around, or very rarely, right? If it would be random, you would expect the distribution sort of off the target to be right and left somewhat distributed equally. It's not the case. People don't overestimate the time that they need. They underestimate it pretty much always because they think everything is going to go smoothly. If everything is going to go smoothly, I'll take 3 weeks. Well, things never go smoothly, right? And then you take more than 3 weeks. So there are lots of biases like that. So I used to think, okay, really these things are, so bias is not really an ethical problem. That's not an ethical problem. That's just a cognitive fact. There are statistical biases. These are facts in data science, for example. And if you have a biased data set, then you'll get a biased result. Okay, big deal. That's a question of doing a good job as a data scientist, not to have a biased data set for the specific purpose that you're using. And that seems to be quite separate from the fairness question. So I thought, in fact, I had a PhD student who wrote their thesis about this, that there's one question which is what is bias, and then there's another question which is the ethical question, is what is fairness? So bias is a technical question, and fairness is an ethical question, right? So if you use that system to make decisions in a society, then it can be fair or unfair, and that's then ethical. So I now tend to think that that's not the way to see it. All of these things are normative judgments. They're just having different impact on different people, okay? So in these cases, if it's unfair, then it really has real impact on real people who, I don't know, don't get a credit card or something like that, right? That's an experience. I applied at a Greek bank when I was working there to get a credit card, and the bank asked me 1,000 questions about my life, and then eventually they came back and said, no. So I said, wait, why is that? Employee goes, central offices. And I said, well, how did they, I don't know. So somebody in central offices decided that this guy is not reliable and we shouldn't give him a credit card, on which basis the employee, I think, honestly told me they didn't know it either. it just happened from central offices, right? That's the kind of thing that we call opacity. And perhaps unfair. I don't know whether it was unfair. Maybe it was not unfair. Summary of my remarks is that I think the important thing in AI is to realize that what you're doing always involves normativity already. There is no such thing as any action not involving normativity. You always decide that something is good for a purpose. That's already in there. So you should better reflect on that rather than just being a slave of the passions, right? And we have to do this. So in the case of AI, we cannot wait for the AI to provide the normativity. That is something that AI cannot do. So normative metacognition is not something that AI systems can do, and I don't think we'll be able to do ever. But we can, and we have to, right? We cannot say, oh, we'll just go on and do something, and we'll see what happens. Because when you do something, you're already using a goal, okay? You are putting a goal in there, so you better put a right goal in there and reflect on that goal. So whatever you do in AI already does involve goals. That's my suggestion. So I think that, and therefore intelligence is not just the ability to pursue goals successfully, but also to pursue goals and to reflect on what your goals should be. And I was suggesting that perhaps a sort of minimal approach to ethics where you don't try to make a distinction between normative and a smaller set of ethical things will actually help us understand better what technical artifacts like AI do, because it's not all that different from what we do. Thanks.
Okay, is this working? Yes? All right, thank you so much, Vincent, for that highly stimulating talk and for also respecting the time limit. That's great. So we have 10 minutes for question. Okay,
confuse everybody successfully.
All right, so think about it. Maybe a first question while you guys are thinking about it. Okay, so that's very interesting. I have say questions about the kind of distinctions that you want to collapse in your proposal. So I take it that it's standard to think that practical rationality, so thinking rationally about what we should do, include both instrumental reason and moral reason, right? And you want to say, well, okay, these two are both normative, and that's true, right? We're thinking about what we should do, but with regard to instrumental rationality, we want to know what we should do given the goals that we have set, right? So in AI, that can be, we want to optimize, we want the tool to be more accurate, you want the tool to, achieve its value or objective function. But we still need moral reasoning, right? To go back to Annette's talk, to critically assess these more technical goals or instrumental goals, right? So if that's the case, I'm not clear. So what is it that we're gaining if we collapse the distinction?
Okay, so yeah, thanks. Maybe I didn't explain that very well. So obviously you're right to say that we continue to need the distinction between instrumental reasoning towards an existing goal and reasoning about the goal. I agree with that. What I disagree with is the suggestion that the reasoning about the goals falls into two categories: ethical reasoning about the goals and other. That's the part where I don't see where the distinction is made, you see? So we often try to make that distinction where we say, oh, this is an ethical concern, this is not an ethical concern for the goal, but that's where I think it's not, at least it's not useful to make that distinction. But I agree, and I should have said this more clearly, that there is clearly the possibility of just pursuing instrumentally some kind of reasoning process without questioning the goal. that's perfectly fine. Yeah.
Right, thank you. I understand. In some cases, we could say, well, these are two kind of ethical goals, and perhaps they will conflict, and then we have to go one step, meta, in order to say it's accuracy and fairness.
You smuggled in the E word there, you see? So two kinds of ethical goals. What I'm suggesting is let's not do that. Let's just talk about goals.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, question.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. My name is Émilie Dion, so I'm at Université Laval. I'm curious how it goes in your class when you're teaching this to the AI engineer. How do they react? How do they receive this? And what happens then? Just in relation to that conversation about normativity being embedded in the algorithms. Thank you.
I would say a certain sigh of relief is happening. So the way, let's put it this way. I have a title, I'm a professor of ethics. I should be able to say in one sentence right there what ethics is. Okay, I really should. I mean, it's part of my job description. Okay, and yet I don't have that very easily. I mean, I've just talked about it for a very long time, which is not a good idea. So, and that happens in ethics classes too. So they have a rough idea that ethics is something like the kind of thing that says this is allowed and this is not allowed, right? And what I've been trying to suggest in ethics classes, I've been teaching ethics classes for 20 years or so, is always you've already been doing ethics before you entered this room, because you've already thought about what's right and wrong before you enter this room, and not just what your mom or the priest or something told you. And I now find it easier to explain that notion if I say you are thinking about what is right or wrong in all sorts of contexts already, and that is a thought where you say, why is this right or this is wrong? Well, this is wrong because if you do it like that, then the machine, I don't know, gets destroyed. So you shouldn't do it like that. So you already have this structure that something is good for a certain purpose. So what we're doing in this class is we're reflecting on the purposes. And that is something that engineers, in my experience, find easy to grasp, because they say, and the engineering problem is a problem where you have a clearly defined purpose and environment, and you can say, I clearly, given my tools, I can do this, right? So the notion of goals, given an initial state, is something that engineers and computer science people like, because that's part of what they do. It's, second footnote, it's part of the exercise in which I think is very important here, namely that I'm not just trying to tell them about philosophy, I'm trying to learn something from them about reasoning. And I think I have learned a little bit. That's my suggestion. So here comes an AI engineer with philosopher who will tell me I'm wrong.
I don't. Jean-Gabriel Ganassia, Sorbonne University.
The mic.
So, I have a question about your definition of intelligence. You mentioned that you gave 3 definitions, but all were defined with respect to the goal. And do you think it's a real definition of intelligence? Because you have different definition of intelligence. So it can be a mind, but it can be also, so it covers all our cognitive abilities, faculties, which is not related to a goal. Now, I would like to go more in depth at this question. So you have in traditional philosophy the idea of judgment, which is very important, because if you have no judgment, you cannot, you are like a fool, so you cannot behave ethically. And now, from very concrete point, you remember, I think 3 years ago, you have this car accident with an autonomous car, which I think belonged to Uber company, and a woman, you remember, it was on the road, and after the accident, the inquiry show that the sensor worked correctly. But the problem was that we had the Uber company decided to modify the sensitivity of the sensor. So maybe it's in a way it's correspond to the notion of judgment, which is the evaluation of the situation. So I think it's part of ethical behavior to have a correct judgment, and it's not directly related to the goal. I'm sorry for my long question.
Okay.
It's a question I have personally.
Yes. So, so first of all, I used a bit of a trick here. So I didn't actually define intelligence. I mentioned people who define it.
Yes. Okay. I understand that.
But having said that, it seemed to me that with the little correction that I tried to make at the end, plus normative reflection, right? That is roughly correct. So that would mean that if it is whatever it is that it makes you achieve your goals, this would certainly imply judgment, right? Because you might in some cases you might actually really sit down and try to think, right? What is the best thing to do here, and actually make judgments about various aspects of the world, and make even some logical inferences or something like that. So that's all going to be part of your intelligence. One of the problems of that definition is, of course, that one part of the intelligence is also going to be how your body is structured, right? So if you have, for example, a hand with a finger and a thumb, opposing thumb, is very useful for grasping stuff. So that, in that sense, that makes us more intelligent than the dolphins, because the dolphins can't grasp things so easily. Okay, that's a bit counterintuitive, I would say, but that's clearly a consequence of this kind of definition. I kind of like the definition after reflecting on it for a while, because it involves the classical philosophical tradition of rational thought and judgment, it seems to me, but also involves broader notions, and it does suggest that intelligence is not just this intellectual ability, but there's something more to it. If I may say so, I read the other day a little slogan where somebody said, "If you're so intelligent, why aren't you happy?" Which struck me as a pretty severe criticism. And it's a good criticism for people like you and me, because we're good at intellectual stuff, relatively, okay? But is that really something that's conducive to us reaching our goals? And if not, maybe we're making a mistake, right? Then it's actually not that intelligent to sit over books and do all that other stuff. Maybe we should be doing something else instead. But so in that sense, even though I have sort of sold you the definitions to other people, it seems to me that they work pretty well.
So, no, it was the notion of judgment as understood as a classical definition, the fact that you're able to categorize a situation and to evaluate the situation. And I think it's part of our ethical behavior.
Definitely.
And it's an open problem to, especially in our
yes, and definitely our ability
context,
to
categorize
is part of the intelligence, right? I'm going to deal with this question the way I've dealt with other questions of that sort before, because it's the same kind of thing, right? I don't think about the problem again. So that will be part of it. So if it works, then yes, then this definition sort of encompasses the traditional philosophical baggage that we have from rationalism onwards, and cognitive science.
All right. So is the question rather short? Yeah. Okay. So go ahead. That's going to be the last one before the break.
He has notes.
It's fast, I promise. So you mentioned humans must supply normativity for machines. So I work in security, and I'm worried about regulation.
Sorry. Try to speak slowly and into the microphone so I can hear you. Yeah.
So you mentioned in your talk, humans must supply normativity for the machines. So coming from security, I'm worried about regulation. Is normativity universal?
I guess the question is should normativity be universal?
Sure. I'm more concerned about when you have different views of normativity being applied by different governments.
Right. So, so the answer to my question, well, the answer to your question, is it actually universal, is no. There is, however, a lot more overlap than we think, right? So we, to use a classic example, some people will say it's a good idea to bury the dead. You should put them in the soil. That's the appropriate thing to do. And other people say, this is horrible. You can't do that kind of thing. You should burn them. And other people have other ideas yet again, right? There are different cultural practices, what we do with the dead. That doesn't mean that there is a fundamental disagreement there, because the fundamental agreement is we should deal with the dead in a respectful, ceremonial way. No culture throws the dead in the rubbish. Okay, so we think there is an underlying structure that is the same. So the underlying structure between, let's say, the Chinese government's approach to surveillance and my approach is that we need a balance between personal freedom and security. Both of these are important aims, right? Where to strike the right balance is a very difficult question, and in some cases we don't agree on that. But I think it's kind of good to remember that the agreement isn't all that far away, and it's also good to remember, at least in my view, I'm not a relativist. In other words, I think there is a correct answer here. We just need to find it. Okay? So if some people think it is, I don't know, appropriate to discriminate against people on the basis of skin color, I would just say that is wrong. It's not, I would not say, oh, that's the way you do it in your culture, all right. Okay? That's what relativists would say. So I think there is actually a correct answer, which in your field, for example, you should try to find to balance these things that you think are important there. If I may add to that, if you want to find such an answer, it's very important that you speak to different stakeholders in the society. Because if you are trying to do this from the point of view of technical experts, for example, in your field, then you will ignore the fact that you are already in a particular position in society with particular interests. Right? So you have to ask other people who are in different positions and have different interests in order to find out a good way to do it. And probably it's dynamic too, right? It will change.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Vincent, again, for this great talk.
So our last speaker today is Karina Vold. It is my pleasure to introduce her. She is assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Institute for the History of Philosophy of Science and Technology. She works at the intersection of the philosophy of cognitive science, the philosophy of technology, artificial intelligence, and applied ethics. She is cross-appointed at the IHPST and the Department of Philosophy. In her recent work, Vold has written on the implication of theories of extended cognition, on responsible innovation in online therapy, and on the capabilities and risk of AI. She has a PhD from McGill University, Montreal. So it is my pleasure to welcome her today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I hope everyone can see me and see my slides. It's nice to be able to discuss some of my work with all of you, and I do regret that I could not be there physically in Montreal this week, but thank you for accommodating my absence. I just want to also say thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's great to talk about these issues. So I was invited to discuss the topic of AI ethics, including questions like where are we now, where have we been, and what should we hope for in the future. So I thought I would use the opportunity to discuss a paper that I co-wrote a few years back that I thought would be relevant for this conversation, and as well as to cover a bit of background along the different issues, ethical issues that have arisen in AI design in particular. So in this paper that I'll talk about, My co-authors, Dorian Peters, Raphael Calvo, Diana Robinson, and myself, describe some of the difficulties that have arisen from trying to move from principles to practice in the implementation of ethical guidelines around the use of artificial intelligence, and in particular, deep learning systems, which have emerged in the last 5 years or more. So in the paper, we present two complementary frameworks for integrating ethical analysis into engineering practice. And we hope that this can help address the challenge, aforementioned challenge. So we published this paper after working with a company who was doing some applied AI work around cognitive behavioral therapy and AI. So a company that actually has helped sort of provide internet-delivered cognitive behavioral therapy and then ran natural language processing over the conversations that were being had. And through working with that company, we developed these different frameworks for what we thought would be a helpful way to integrate ethical analysis into the engineering practice, especially involving AI technologies. So the paper we published is in the IEEE Transactions on Technology and Society. I believe it's from a year ago now. So it's a bit older research, but I hope it will still be relevant for today's discussions. So here's an outline of what I'll cover in my lecture. I'll begin with some background covering what have sometimes been referred to as the first and second wave of AI ethics. I'll then look at the frameworks we put forward for responsible technology development. First, the responsible design process framework, and second, the sphere of technology experience. I'll then end with a brief conclusion. So after there were major advancements in deep learning starting around 2012 or 2014, this led to new technological advances, which in turn led to new ethical concerns. I think with this group, I hardly have to mention them, but examples, of course, include things like facial recognition technologies, which were embedding social and racial biases, new threats to privacy around the data collection and use of data from all of our individual cell phones, for example, questions around explainability, questions around how we could ever trust or get accountability from systems that were so internally complex with so many hidden layers in the neural networks. So the thought being that if we can't understand or explain their operations, how could we account for their behaviors and how could we trust their behaviors? Many other concerns too emerged around the use of psychometrics and predictive analytics to guide micro-targeted advertising, for example. I'm thinking especially of the 2016 elections that happened, and even about the weaponization of AI. So there was a great deal of talk around self-driving cars, as well as lethal autonomous weapons at this time. So as a response to these concerns, many people began to recognize that if it was deployed responsibly and carefully, AI could be a huge benefit to humanity. But if not, it could have serious negative consequences for individuals and society. Growing recognition around these concerns led to numerous governments and international organizations, including corporations, NGOs, professional bodies, public sector organizations, private companies, governments, to begin to release sets of ethical principles that were intended to govern the use of AI in an ethically acceptable way. This article that I have pictured here is from 2019. And it conducted a kind of meta review. The authors conducted a kind of meta analysis around all the different lists of governing principles for AI that had been released in the last 5 years prior to the article. So from 2014 to 2019, they identified over 75 lists of governing principles on AI that had been released in those years. And these came from organizations like the OECD, the UK House of Lords, the European Commission, the G7 countries, the IEEE, and corporations like Google and Microsoft, just to name a few. Perhaps most familiar for everyone in the audience today would be the Declaration of Responsible AI from Montreal that was released around this time as well and is included in this set. Montreal, I think, and this declaration in particular was one of the early ones, so that was exciting to see Canada's role in coming out with some of these lists of principles as well. This figure from the article mentioned, Jobin, Ionka, and Vienna's article from 2019, shows the geographic distribution of issuers of ethical AI guidelines by the number of documents released. So most ethic guidelines were released in the United States. They had identified of those 75, around 20 of them. And within the European Union, 19, followed by the United Kingdom having 14, and Japan with 4. Shortly after this was when Beijing released their principles. I think it didn't quite make the meta survey, but was around 2018. So there was more representation from other parts of the world that emerged slightly after this article was published. Just to give you a sense of sort of where they were coming from in terms of both companies, sort of the bodies that were releasing them, as well as the geographic distribution. Now, what did these principles actually say, and was there consensus amongst them? Well, interestingly, in another meta-analysis that was released around the same time, this one by the people at AI for People project, this came out also around 2018. So in this case, what the authors found was that despite there being such a proliferation of guidelines from actors and apparently bodies that would seem to have different interests or competing interests, most of these frameworks were fairly well aligned. So it seemed that they had even converged on a small set of principles. So this diagram is from this article I mentioned by the AI for People project with Luciano Floridi as the lead author, but also quite a number of authors. I won't mention them all. What it shows is that the meta-analysis they performed identified 4 key principles that roughly corresponded with the 4 classical principles of medical ethics. The first is beneficence. This is going from the left to the right in the dark gray. Beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, or respect for autonomy, and justice. Interestingly, there seemed to be a new principle that emerged around the use of AI in particular, which the authors called explicability. So this 5th principle seemed to capture concerns of the sort that I mentioned around the explainability or interpretability of systems and how sort of transparent their algorithms were, which seemed to be important for enabling some of these other values or principles in themselves. So it was interesting to see this kind of reduction could be made. Now, the idea that the development of AI systems and robotic systems can and should be governed by a set of principles is long-standing. So everyone's probably familiar with Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. So these were first introduced, I think, in his 1942 story Runaround. Here I have pictured iRobot. That's just because it had a nicer image, honestly. But the principles appear, or the laws of robotics that he offers in these works of science fiction appear in quite a few of his stories. Now, I won't read all of these out loud. They're sort of, in a way, commonsensical in the way that the principles I showed you on the previous slide are. So, for example, the first law says a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Now, what's key here is that there's an attempt to axiomatize a set of ethical principles to govern the system. And notice that for Asimov, he was writing a fictional narrative that is often driven by conflict. So in his story, and most of his stories are premised on the idea that these laws will come into conflict, and that's usually what drives the different stories. So it was interesting that in this sort of what I call the first wave of AI ethics that we saw emerging from the years around 2014 to 2019, there were many attempts to govern AI in a similar way, that is through a small set of basic principles which inevitably led to conflict or tension between principles. This is a study, a kind of report that was released for the Ada Lovelace Institute, one that I was peripherally involved in during my postdoc time at the University of Cambridge's Lever-Hume Center for the Future of Intelligence. So in that report, which was led by Jessica Whittlestone and released in 2019, there were quite a few key tensions that were identified. So some of the values that we mentioned before, for example, that were forcing technology designers and policymakers to make value-based trade-offs. So in applied ethics, we often have to ask these questions. While we've identified a set of 5 key principles or traits that we value, justice, beneficence, and so forth, in practice, we have to ask, how do we trade off values that come into conflict? So, for example, a technology designer might be able to increase privacy at the expense of security or accuracy. Furthermore, they might be able to increase accuracy at the expense of privacy, right? Consider that the more data you collect about people, for example, the better you can predict and make predictions about those people. And so that increases the accuracy, but might come at the cost of privacy. Moreover, some technologies might increase the well-being of someone at the expense of others. So sometimes well-being has to trade off with higher level societal values such as fairness and solidarity. And the examples here are numerous. So we could think about all sorts of ways in which these values conflict. Quality of services that we want to offer with AI can compete against privacy. So using personal data might improve public services by tailoring them based on personal characteristics or demographics, but compromise personal privacy because of high data demands. Personalization might conflict with solidarity. We've seen this. So increasing personalization of services and information may bring into conflict or may bring economic and individual benefits rather, but will risk creating furthering divisions and undermining community solidarity. Convenience, we can imagine, might conflict with dignity. So increasing automation and quantification could make lives more convenient, which is something we value, but it risks undermining those unquantifiable values and skills that constitute human dignity and human individuality, for example. So the list goes on and on. I'm happy to give more examples here, but essentially, what people quickly realize is that while we can agree on this consensus of principles, translating them into practice can be more complicated than we'd like often. Another challenging element to the pursuit of ethically designed AI systems is that how one balances off these trade-offs that I mentioned earlier between different ethical principles is also going to depend quite critically on the context or sector that we're working within. So, for example, how one trades off accuracy for explainability might be very different in healthcare versus policing. In healthcare, you might want to optimize accuracy to ensure you get the best treatment recommendation, let's imagine. But often the most accurate algorithms involve more complex methods. And so the internal logic of these really complex systems is extremely difficult to understand, even for developers. So if we want some explainability in healthcare, that's going to come at the cost of accuracy, potentially. And you can imagine how these different trade-offs and how we value certain things are going to change across these different sectors. So in healthcare, I might put a high value on my privacy, whereas in retail, what I buy, what I should buy at the grocery store, let's say, I don't have such a high value of privacy on. So the recent focus on ethical AI and the increased concerns over its unintended negative impacts around this time was also happening against a backdrop in which ethical analysis was traditionally excluded from engineering practice. So the coupling of these events, we argue in our paper, made the need for frameworks even more important or more urgent. So we needed frameworks to help guide how we were going to translate some of these principles into practice. And engineers, of course, have always met basic ethical standards concerning safety, security, functionality. When an engineer builds, a structural engineer, let's say, builds a bridge, they've got to look out for meeting basic concerns around safety and security. But issues to do with things like justice and bias, maybe things like technology addiction or other kinds of indirect societal harms, those were traditionally outside the scope of what engineers would receive in their education and training. We've seen some shift in this, I think, since this time, right? So more and more computer science programs, for example, are including courses around AI ethics. And that's, I think, a great shift. But what we argue in the paper is that engineers shouldn't be expected to do the work of philosophers and psychologists and sociologists, let's say. They need to do work with these experts in these disciplines to help anticipate and mitigate ethical risks as a standard of practice. So in other words, it's no longer acceptable for technology to be released into the world without that responsible design practice behind it. And the same we would say, it would not be responsible for engineers to design and build a bridge without considering, in the first case, what would count as a responsible design practice. So considering safety concerns. AI researchers, developers of the technologies we're seeing, software engineers these days need to do the same thing. So that's the kind of motivation behind the frameworks that I'll present. So as I mentioned, my co-authors and I wanted to contribute to resolving some of the translational difficulties between principles to practice. And we try to attempt this by offering a couple of frameworks that we believe together with the outcomes of an example of an ethical analysis in the context of digital mental health, which we offer in the paper, can provide some tools for how to develop more responsible design practices. So our hope is that both of these frameworks can provide tools and insights for data-enabled and intelligent technology development, construed very broadly. So we begin a discussion of our frameworks by emphasizing the importance of grounding all ethical impact assessments in multidisciplinary expertise. So as I've mentioned, we can't expect engineers to become trained at this type of analysis, given that it's a specialization of other experts. So the importance of this multivocal approach, I think, can't be overstated, as there can be a tendency for agile teams to consist of just programmers, designers, and managers. Here we have 6 different fields that we think should be centrally involved in the ethical design and development of AI and data-enabled systems. So these should not be the only fields necessarily, but it was kind of a way of mapping for those of you who are familiar with this. This hexagonal mapping is reflected in sort of the birth of cognitive science, where it was connecting 6 different disciplines and mapping out their existing relationships. So in the case of AI ethics and AI ethical design, we've included sociology, philosophy, psychology, computer science, engineering, design, and human-computer interaction. So one can include other fields as well: history, literature, science and technology studies. We think that all of these should have a voice at the table. But the main point here is that there's no one single discipline capable of handling the task of ethical analysis single-handedly. Given the complexity of the problems, the best outcomes are likely to come from the richest diversity. And it's nice to say that I think there are encouraging conversations happening along these lines more and more. Okay, so I'll turn to our first framework, which we call the responsible design process. So for those who aren't familiar, there's a field called responsible innovation. Okay, it's a growing field of research which explores the ways of taking care of the future through collective stewardship of science and innovation in the present. That quote comes from a paper from 2013 by Jack Stilko and 2 co-authors, Owen and McNaughton. So as with many design practices, the goal of our framework is to embed deliberation within the design and innovation process. So as we've seen, some technology designers, policymakers are forced to make these value trade-offs, and the value-laden decisions that arise as part of engineering can either be addressed in a superficial way by one or a few individuals on a team, or in a more systematic and robust way by teams. And really only the latter approach can hold up to scrutiny if negative consequences emerge later. So that's why, in addition to ethical principles of the kind we saw in that first wave of AI ethics, we need a technology development process that makes room for this sort of robust decision-making and for the ethical impact analysis on which it must stand. So we argue that a responsible technology development process will need to incorporate evidence-based methods for evaluating the impact on designing for human well-being by drawing on psychology. An important aspect of responsible innovation and our responsible design process is the concept of human well-being, which is also at the center of many current ethical frameworks. So, for example, the IEEE's centers its ethics specifications on human well-being, and so too do several government frameworks. But our conception of a responsible development process also involves taking existing design processes, particularly those that are anticipatory, reflexive, inclusive, and responsive, and augmenting them with methods for ethical analysis and well-being supportive design. So this double diamond diagram is based off of a UK Design Council project with consolidated commonalities around design process. And what we can see is that the broadest and narrowest points of the design of the diamonds represent points of divergence and convergence. So we begin with this standard process and integrated stages for well-being support and ethical design, making to create the resulting responsible design process framework, presenting in this figure you see. So well-being in the diagram refers to human psychological well-being, and it's included separately to other ethical issues because evidence-based design methods grounded in psychological research already exist for it and allow it to be attended to empirically, which is something we put a priority on. Analysis of other ethical dimensions such as fairness, data governance, ecosystem well-being, democratic participation, and so forth cannot rely predominantly on psychological research, and we think would require different methods. So I'll just walk you through each stage of this framework. So it starts with a research phase involving investigating the needs, preferences, contexts, lives of the people who will be served or otherwise impacted by a technology. This phase includes standard approaches to other research, including design thinking methods, ethnographies, participatory workshops, and so forth, as well as expert review and secondary research in relation to the specific domain. Standard approaches can surface well-being and ethical issues. However, tailoring these methods to focus participants on ethical or psychological reflection is particularly important. So the insight phase involves the analysis of the data from the research phase and synthesis into specific insights for design. So data analysis can be done through the lens of a well-being theory with a view to anticipating harms and opportunities for supporting healthy psychological experience. Also, ethodatics analysis can be done through the lens of an ethical theory, so like the ones of the guidelines I mentioned earlier, and with a view to identifying potential biases, ethical risks, or tensions. So remember that, again, the team pulling on or doing this analysis should be pulling on a multidisciplinary background. And then third is an ideation phase, which involves the divergent generation of ideas for design solutions. Ethical reflection can be integrated into the ideation phase through framing. For example, introducing well-being psychology concepts into the ideation phase can help the team focus on root psychological causes of user needs, while introducing ethical concepts into ideation can sensitize the team to potential ethical tensions that could arise, so that brainstorming can involve resolutions to these. In the prototyping phase,
the team converges on and builds various design solutions. Responsible impact analysis involves collaborative speculation on the well-being and ethical impacts, both good and bad, to which a particular design concept may lead. So when we say the ethical impacts, we're talking about both benefits and potential harms. So the stage ideally would involve a range of stakeholders, including end users. And we'll say more about who those stakeholders and end users are in just a moment. Finally, the real-life ethical impacts that a technology will have on people, their communities, and the planet can only be fully understood once the product or service is in the real world. I think we're seeing a great example of that with ChatGPT right now. So there were earlier iterations of GPT, GPT-2, GPT-3, which was studied before being released. But now that ChatGPT has had the uptake that it's had amongst users from all different domains, we're sort of experiencing potential ethical concerns as well as potential uses in a way that we couldn't fully predict. My example is it's like building a jungle gym and then releasing 100 kids on it. You just don't know how it's going to work until you see it. So teams, should speculate in advance and test in advance, but unintended use patterns are realities in our complex social technical systems. So the evaluation phase is a post-launch phase. Well-being impact evaluation, the writing on the top there involves evaluating the impact of the technology use on a user's psychological experience during and after use, while ethical impact evaluation, mentioned on the bottom there, involves evaluating the ethical impacts of a technology's use, not just on its users, but often also on those indirectly affected, such as friends, families, communities, society as a whole. So that's what we'll say more about. So our second framework is about the sphere of technology experience. So there's been, I think, a lack of appreciation for the different resolutions at which technology can have an impact on the experience of a user or even a non-user. A technology can make an impact through the design of its interface based on the tasks it is designed to support, through the behaviors it promotes, or as a collective result of the widespread societal use. So for instance, consider the way that games or even gamified type ranking systems like YouTube's algorithm have an impact on well-being and autonomy. A user might experience a strong sense of autonomy and well-being during gameplay, but because the game is designed often to increase compulsive engagement, a resulting addiction might diminish that same user's experience of autonomy at a life level or at a different level. So as the system, if you start to become addicted and overuse these systems, it will crowd out, other opportunities in life, whether it's family time or things that might have other greater importance to that user. So you can ask then, does YouTube support or hinder our autonomy? And our answer is something like both, but we need an analysis at these different levels of impact. So hence the need for this, this further framework. So we're seeking here greater precision on how we can effectively identify impacts at different granularities within the technology experience. This framework was first highlighted in earlier work by some of my co-authors, Dorian Peters and Rafael Calvo. And that work was concerned primarily with the spheres of impact on the autonomy of the user. But here we cast it as a broader framework, one that can be used to assess the technology experience more generally. So we've identified 6 distinct spheres within which well-being can be influenced. This framework can be usefully applied to provide a structure for the ethical impact analysis conducted during that aforementioned responsible development process. All right, so again, I'm just going to walk you through these different stages before I wrap up here. So in the next 5 minutes. First is the sphere of adoption. So this refers to the experience of a technology prior to its use, including the marketing and sociocultural factors that force or cause a person to eventually uptake the technology. So a development team may want to consider the ethical impacts of the forces leading to uptake and to what extent users are choosing to use a product freely or being coerced or pressured to do so. As a simple example, a new upgrade on your phone, right? Sometimes that's forced, or even on your computer, sometimes that's forced onto existing users. That's an approach that is notoriously user-friendly. But it could also be introduced in a way that sort of better respects autonomy. So it can try to encourage a user to try the upgrade first, for example. The interface sphere is the first sphere of the user experience properly. So it actually involves interacting with the product itself, including the use of the navigating, the interface, buttons, controls. At this level, an ethical analysis might explore issues to do with autonomy and inclusion. For example, to what extent does the interface support autonomy? To what extent is it easy enough to use for folks who may have different interfacing capacities? Are users of different abilities or of different cultures being excluded from that interface experience? Okay, the third is the level of tasks. So tasks refers to discrete activities that are enabled or enhanced by the technology. Combinations of tasks contribute to one's overall behavior. So this is our fourth sphere. So for example, the task of step counting with your Fitbit, right? So step counting might be a task. That over time, those collections of those tasks, so collections of instances in which you're step counting, might contribute to the emergence of some overall behavior. Let's call it regular exercise. So for technologies intending to positively impact on a particular behavior, let's say running or meditation, it's important to consider this sort of psychological literature on the effects of various approaches to supporting behavior and the tasks that constitute one's behavior. The sort of final and broadest sphere within the user experience is the life sphere. So this is meant to capture the impacts of a technology at a life level. Not all technologies have significant life impacts. So they might not have a sort of impact that's significant enough to yield measurable effects on a person's quality of life. A calculator helps me out, but maybe it doesn't really increase my quality of life. While a self-driving car might impact measures of autonomy and well-being at the life sphere for some people, for someone who's visually impaired, the extent to which, using a self-driving car might help their life is enormous. So it's a little bit relative, right, to the user in a lot of these cases. So you have to figure out, which technologies are having significant enough impacts on the life sphere that it's worth considering. But this should be part of that process. So many technologies have only narrow applications, whereas some have much wider applications. Finally, expanding beyond the user experience into the broadest sphere, society involves the direct and collateral impact on non-users, non-human life, and the environment. So a self-driving car, as another example, might promote well-being for some users, but it might decrease it for others whose livelihood depends on driving, or the impact on the environment that it has may be really significant. So these types of trade-offs at this broader level of non-users and non-human life can really only be revealed at that societal level of analysis, which entails looking beyond the actual user experience into this broader impact of the technology. Okay, so I'm going to end there and just say that our suggestion in this paper was really to provide a couple frameworks for thinking more broadly about how to translate these high-level principles around which there seems to be much consensus into the actual practice of building and designing these technologies. So I'm looking forward to our questions and discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Vold. So as was just established, there will be a 10-minute question, so you may begin.
Very good and pedagogical presentation. I'm Alexandre Barbosa from the Brazilian Network Information Center. I do agree that it is very challenging moving from principles to practice. And if governments are willing to establish governance, AI governance mechanisms and regulation, we need to measure. And for me, it seems that in all those frameworks that we have, you have mentioned 70 plus frameworks. I know 3 of them, UNESCO, OECD, and European Commission. For me, there is a really missing piece, which is related to measurement. And you have explained how your paper brings evidence-based methods for evaluation, which looks very interesting. I'm very curious to read your paper. And my question is, how do you envision that your paper could contribute to these frameworks in terms of incorporating a measurement dimension that, in my opinion, it is missing? And I would like to ask you if you agree that there is a missing part in these frameworks, how to measure, for instance, how key stakeholders, especially AI-based system providers, are really incorporating ethical dimension and transparency and all these principles. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Yeah, so I think there's a couple different issues around measurement. I think you're right to bring it up. So first, you know, as we saw, the principles that there seems to be consensus around, things like explainability, transparency, privacy, these are such high-level concepts that it's hard to know how we can measure these in general, let alone agree on some consensus for each term. So whether or not our, you know, the different, so there's that issue around just like, how can we agree on the terms, and are these the sorts of things that can be measured? What we focused on in our paper was this idea of psychological well-being, which is controversial. People think that well-being can mean all sorts of different things, and that there's a sense in which, you know, well-being is a subjective thing that can't be measured, essentially. So trying to measure it is almost like a category mistake in a way. I do think there's some ways in which we can pull out like how much data about a person is being used, how is it being used. If we're thinking about ChatGPT, what kind of level of bias does it display in its outputs relative to what we might see in human outputs? A second question that you raised was around whether or not the companies that released, or organizations that have released these measures or these principles, so referring to those 75 list principles, to what extent are they interested in measuring how well they've performed relative to these principle benchmarks, let's call them, that they've set out. It's less obvious to me that the creators or the generators of these lists of principles have really shown an interest in measuring their own performance relative to the benchmarks. So part of the skepticism, I think, that existed around this first wave of AI ethics was the amount of self-regulation that was being suggested. So it was like a lot of companies, for example, that were you know, putting out principles and saying we were going to abide by these, but without any clear, you know, measuring or tracking of what a success would look like. So anyway, so there's a long way to go, I think, in terms of how we can measure things like privacy or autonomy, or measure the success of the application of these principles.
Does that work? Yeah, perfect. I thank you for your presentation. One question that I had relates to the responsible design process framework with the two. I'm not sure how that's called in English, so I just dropped the name of that geometrical form. Well, so regarding that process, at each stage there was always like the ethical consideration and then the well-being consideration. And I was wondering how do you weight one another? Like you said, like in your last response, that there's some, it's very hard to have like an objective metric when it comes to well-being. It's a very subjective aspect. So what is the goal? Is it like that if in each stage of the process we reach something that promotes well-being and follows other ethical consideration, then it might give us indication that we're in the right direction? What's the exact roles of those? Is it just to multiply the individuals that have a voice in the process? So I think that it's very meaningful in your project that you're breaking down in different pieces what AI implementation is. But I was wondering what was the exact interaction in each stage.
Yeah, great question. So I don't think there's a simple like mathematical, multiply this by that and we'll figure out the way to go. So there might be, but you're right that we want to pull apart the kind of well-being of the user. So how these technologies are contributing to or promoting the kinds of life satisfactions that characterize psychological well-being versus the sort of broader ethical impacts of the technology. So performing the ethical analysis separate from that well-being analysis is one way of just pulling apart those different aspects. And then, in an ideal scenario, they won't be coming into conflict per se. So, I think, but basically the point is that there needs to be that conversation around both of these at each step in the process that we've identified. So the research, ideation, prototyping, as well as that final analysis or post hoc analysis. Not sure if that answers your question. I hope I got to it.
Thank you. That's good.
Okay. All right. So last stage of our first session. Thanks a lot to the three speakers. Karina, do you hear me well?
Like I'm a giant floating head.
All right. So Karina, do you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Good. So thank you, Karina, for your talk. It was lovely to hear you address these issues. Okay. So now we have at least 30 minutes for a discussion. What's always missing in these academic events is time for discussion. So now we have some time. I want to offer the speakers a chance to say comment or ask questions about what the colleagues said. So just make sure to let us know if you'd like to intervene or ask a question or comment on one of your colleagues' presentations. And all of you think about questions. I'll start with one question for the same question for the three of you. Okay. So it's a broader conference. So it's a panel or a session on AI ethics. What have we accomplished in the past, say, 5 or 6 years, since maybe 2017, 2018, where many of these charters and declarations were drafted, and it's also prospective, now. So what should we hope for? What should be our aims at this stage in the discussion? And this session is embedded in a larger conference on different modes of regulation of AI technologies. Okay, so we heard many good ideas. We heard from Annette about adopting a purpose mindset, which sounds like a very wise advice, and ask, the prior question, to build or not to build, and this is clearly something that should be asked. We heard about, so what's a good engineer, what's good engineering, and Vincent suggests that maybe there's clearly not a dichotomy between, say, more technical norms and technical goods and ethical or moral ones, right? We have normative reasons to design technologies in different ways, and being a good engineer includes tackling what we used to call before Vincent asked us not to, includes, so there are ethical tensions or ethical goods that we want to achieve. So we heard, reflections on what it is to be a good engineer, and now we heard with Karina thoughts about the responsible innovation approach. And that in addition to good engineers, we also need multidisciplinary teams, because we cannot expect engineers to solve these the complex social problems. Okay, so this is all fruitful, I think, recommendations. What's, from your perspective, all these approaches could be compatible with an approach saying, okay, well, different developers can self-regulate in a way if they not only adopt the right code of ethics, but if they have the purpose mindset, and if their engineers were trained properly, and if a responsible innovation or design approach was put into practice. That could, one could say, well, yeah, we can self-regulate, right, by integrating all these approaches. From your standpoint, what's the role of hard norms enforced by either government agencies or other regulation bodies? Is there AI ethics? Does it also need to contribute to the evolution of hard, positive norms? From laws to new regulations and rules and so on. How does that fit with that other contribution that AI ethics can make? Annette?
Great, Jocelyn, I felt baited by your question, so I will jump in. I think one indicator of the fact that there isn't enough tangible, hard legal regulation in this area is that industry practitioners themselves will, almost with an air of desperation, routinely request to be regulated, because it's almost impossible to operate in a space in which there's either an entire legal vacuum or immense legal uncertainty. And so again, of course, that could be motivated by not the most noble intentions. I'm not willing to attribute to big corporate actors this intention to always act in accordance with legal and ethical principles. It's just really hard to run a business when it's really unclear what sorts of regulations you're going to encounter. Right? So this could be an entirely pragmatic attitude, but I think it tells us something, which is that a lot of different types of actors, including private sector actors in this space, actually want more regulation in this area. I'm much less optimistic than a few other participants in the broader discourse around this topic about something like a Hippocratic oath for developers, any sort of self-regulation effort. I think in many other domains of innovation, we've seen that is not only insufficient, it doesn't really prevent bad outcomes. It's also, on a deeper level, just not democratically legitimate. Democratic legitimacy, by definition, requires public justification and public deliberation. Unless we manage to implement actual processes of deliberation and contestation exactly around the purposes that we aim to strive for in this area, we're simply not going to achieve this value of democratic legitimacy. That's going to be particularly important, of course, when government agencies procure technology from the private sector to deploy it in our civic institutions. But arguably, it doesn't end there, because we can imagine use cases in which no government actor is part of a procurement deal, but it's still true that the population at large experiences the effects of some private sector agent rolling out some tool that everyone ends up interacting with. So democratic legitimacy is a broader concern than just a concern about making public institution AI deployment legitimate. It's actually a much deeper problem, right? So we got to think about, well, what kinds of democratic processes are already available to us that allow us to put value-based conversations around AI on the democratic agenda. And we can look to other domains of democratic decision-making that intersect with scientific innovation, complex topics on which
most ordinary citizens aren't experts. Right? So people always have this worry, well, how can we democratize AI given that we're not all computer scientists, right? Like we have low levels of AI literacy in the broader population. But guess what? We're already in the business of making collective democratic decisions about climate policy, for instance, about medical policies and so on, healthcare. We make many democratic decisions about insurance schemes, welfare benefit allocation mechanisms, and so on. We're not all statisticians. We're not all social scientists. So we're used to making value-based, higher-order decisions about areas that do require quite in-depth technical expertise, but that we can still evaluate from a moral and political perspective when we look at what competing goals we might possibly achieve when we choose one available option over the other. That same logic could be applied to AI policy and regulation. Right? So it's not the case that we should opt out of subjecting AI innovation to democratic scrutiny just because we're not all coding, right? So we have democratic pathways that could point us in a fruitful direction there. It's just that so far we've treated AI with this kind of AI exceptionalist attitude, right? As if AI was this unique and new mysterious thing that makes it inherently and qualitatively different from other complex, high-stakes decision domains. I think that's not always true, so we should empower ourselves to look at what paths we already have available to democratize this space.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent. It's true. Like in gene editing, it's tremendously complex, but we still, it's highly regulated because of the risk of using gene editing tools. Karina or Vincent?
I'm looking at Karina, but okay. So I'll pick up on the beginning of your question. So what have we achieved, and what kind of thing we should be aiming for now? I think I have to distinguish there between the kind of things where I have expertise and the kind of things where I have political views. So I have all sorts of views on what we should be doing as a society, but really these aren't any better than anybody else's. I have some expertise on the academic field, and there I would say we have achieved quite a bit in the sense that we made it into a field. It wasn't a field a couple of years ago, and now we can, it's a plausible thing to say, I'm going to teach a class on ethics of AI, and people do this. And that was not the case, I would say 5 or certainly 10 years ago. So that's an achievement. What I think we need to do is to make sure that we solidify that field in a proper sense so that it is respectable both within our home discipline, that is philosophy, as one area of applied philosophy, and something that contributes, hopefully, to ethics overall, just like other applied ethics fields have already done. And such that we can say to, again, other academics and relevantly interested people, we have expertise in this area of applied ethics, and I think this is useful for you. And of course, in our case, that'll be primarily computer science people, but there'll be other people too. So I think these are the aims that we have, and that will be our contribution to the larger societal aim of, well, a better society, and our contribution to that is to a better understanding of these issues. But as I said, political views, I have those too, but really, even though I get asked about them, I think it's really a bit unfair. I'm not an expert on that.
Thank you, Vincent, and it's good to remind us that, that's a very young field, academic subfield. Sometime, I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I was a bit discouraged because what was passing as AI ethics, but it's normal, right? It's at the beginning, and at some point we'll move towards, high quality, maturity. Karina.
Yeah, thank you. I guess a couple of thoughts. So I think that some of the hesitation around regulating AI is not just a concern that we don't understand the technology in some sense. I think that Annette's right that there's many examples of areas of scientific research that have, to perform the research requires a certain level of expertise. My understanding is that one reason that it's thought that AI is hard to regulate, and I'm not saying I agree with this, is just that it's such a general purpose technology. So when we say AI, its application is in so many different areas and in so many different sectors of use that it's not obvious where the regulation would begin. Is it in the research or is it in the applications, and is it domain specific? So it's unclear whether or not we'd want regulation sort of broadly on the technology, or if we'd want sort of like research oversights, like ethics oversights boards, or if we want to be regulating it within the particular domains in which it's being used. So for example, in health, we might have its own regulation, which is separate from policing and so forth. So I think there's a lot that still can be done there. And I do think we do need some kind of regulation. But I think there's some things about AI that do make it more challenging to regulate than other technologies or domains of scientific research that we've seen. That's not to say that it can't be done. I also think that there is some level of expertise that some people might need to regulate. So while it's true that we don't need all citizens to be experts in AI in order to have a vote, which is true, of course, with other forms of regulation in other domains, it's still the case, I think, that the actual people coming up with policy and regulation do need some technical understanding of how these systems and technologies work. And so getting that right group of expertise in the room, I think, is part of what's holding back our regulations. But I'll also add that AI policy and governance is not my area of expertise. So just some thoughts.
All right, thank you. Alexis, did you want to add something or ask something?
Okay, so I had a general worry that we hear, and I think might be right to address at that moment, is a strategy such as the one you suggest, Annette, which relies on setting the right goal for like deciding this we won't set up as a reasonable goal, and so we won't develop AI in that direction. There's always this problem that surfaces when you think about not doing something, which is like international consensus on that, and especially since AI seems to be like a high bounty kind of domain, whereas if you decide not to develop AI in a certain way, you might face like some disadvantage internationally if others do. So do you believe, does your view on setting the right goals as international political dimension, or is it something that I'm adding to the mix?
Yeah, I think a lot of people in this space are concerned about a kind of new arms race scenario. So I think that is a legitimate concern that drives many of these deployment scenarios. But at the same time, if we take seriously the idea that there might just be some purposes that really lead us astray, either because they help us solve a task that actually just isn't worthy of solving, or because they help us perform tasks that move us further away from justice. I think that should be the guiding principle, even if we're concerned about losing out in comparison to some bad actors internationally. So take, for instance, the cases that we looked at before. It's not really clear to me what type of arms race we're losing if we stop deploying technology that aims to predict sexual orientation. Of course, that doesn't generalize to all kinds of facial recognition technology, right? So it might very well be the case that our domain-specific judgment actually doesn't yield the conclusion, stop developing and deploying facial recognition technology. It's just about the very specific use case there. It's unclear if we lose any sort of strategic advantage there. Then again, it might turn out that actually it is disadvantageous for us for pragmatic strategic reasons to buy into non-deployment for ethical reasons. But that's just another classic trade-off between instrumental aims and ethical aims. Right? We often find ourselves in these dilemmatic situations where it would be advantageous for us to do something, just prudentially, but it would be wrong. Right? So as in many other ethical dilemmas of that sort, I would argue or all things considered judgment should at least incorporate the thought that there is something lost when we go with the instrumentalist route, right? So we kind of need a conceptual and normative account that tells us how much we've fallen short of a really important ethical goal. So you might say, for instance, well, it was pro tanto wrong of us to optimize and deploy in this way. But for all things considered reasons, safety reasons, strategic reasons, we decided to go ahead anyway. Like, that's a possible argument you could run, but unless you actually have an independent normative account of what we've sacrificed in the process, you're going to end up with a really impoverished vision of your decision path. So that's what I'm really concerned about, right? We shouldn't just default to the kind of quick win route that immediately defaults to these strategic arguments. I think it's really important to have a more nuanced and potentially cross-cutting assessment of these considerations.
Hi, my name is Jessica Rowland. I work for Desjardins. And my question was, so I'm not going to summarize because it was well done already, but I found it very interesting, the flow of the discussion or the interventions that we had earlier. And my question is for all three of you. So what I hear, there is a need for transdisciplinarity. And if so, it means that there's a different, within the discussions, there's different worldviews collapsing, right? So have you experienced or seen any cases where we actually went through this exercise of transdisciplinarity? So could you share what type of dynamics can we expect from this discussion? So, comme on dit, sur le plancher des vaches, ça veut dire quoi? So what does it mean? What does it mean to experience or to experience this transdisciplinarity exercise?
Thank you very much for the question. Vincent or Karina, do you want to elaborate on inter or transdisciplinarity, perhaps best practices or examples that we could draw some inspiration from? How does it look? What does it look like on the ground?
Sure. I don't know if I mean, it sounds like you're just looking for some insight on sort of personal experiences, I guess. So, I've co-authored with many computer scientists and engineers at this point, and what does it look like in practice? It's messy. We speak different languages. We're trying to solve different problems. We're trying to ask different questions. There's lots of translational work that has to happen. There are problems that are sort of obvious to philosophers, but are like mind-blowing to other people in other fields, and vice versa. So I think that we're at a point where we'll almost need to have experts, who are dedicated to just doing this type of translational work, because it involves a lot of crossed wires and uncrossing wires. That's all very vague, but just to give examples of facial recognition has come up, and the question of, using facial recognition to identify sexual orientation. Why would why would a technology like that be built? It seems in some ways obviously problematic to some of us. To other people, it seems obviously useful. So talking that out and suggesting why would that, what kind of concerns might result from that, or why that seems like in some cases an obvious misapplication. I've had those conversations, so it suggests that we need more of that, because some things that seem so clear from one discipline are really lost on other disciplines. And traditionally, there are connections between philosophy and psychology, philosophy and computer science. We historically have certain connections. Less so, I think there's sort of weaker interdisciplinary connections between philosophy and human-computer interaction, or philosophy and engineering. So some of those conversations are even newer, I think, even outside of just AI, whereas some disciplines historically have those bonds already, so it's a little bit easier to move forward. So just a few comments, I guess.
Thank you.
Thank you. Did you want to add something, Vincent? Or?
Yeah, perhaps a small sort of an anecdotal thing. I used to think that interdisciplinarity is something that we should get over. I mean, that we should really not be just a philosopher and who works with other people, this otherizing thing. I thought we would just, I'm interested in these problems and the other person's also interested in these problems and we just work on them together. I've changed my mind about that. I tend to think now that it's actually important that I think what is the expertise that I can bring to the table on something, and someone else might have a different expertise to bring to the table, and that we should exploit these things rather than me becoming an amateur computer scientist or something like that. So it's important that we bring this expertise to the table, but we also learn from the other people and shape what we do. So I could not imagine doing the philosophy that I do every now and then, when I do philosophy anyway, without having the influence from other people from other disciplines that I do have. But I still think it's important to realize where I stand and not to pretend that I'm some kind of neutral scientist in a general sense.
Interesting. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I see that we have another question there. Go ahead.
I'm Luca Gianoli from Desjardins as well. And I wanted to raise a point that has been inspired by the no deployment strategy of Professor Zimmermann, and also by the question about should we do or how should we do something that was raised by Professor Müller. Is it in the community, in the scientific community, in the government, are we reasoning about the fact that are we sure we want to outsource fundamental cognitive functions to machines? So what will happen if really broad cognitive functions, soft skill, won't be anymore, let's say, necessary to our lives because we'll have an assistant to help us doing everything? How should are we prepared to deal in a world where so using our brain won't be anymore a necessity, or it will be just an hobby? I don't know. So how can we, let's say, incentive people to train the brain if it's not anymore something that we have to do it in our daily lives, because otherwise we won't be able to do what we need to do every day. So that's something that is scaring me a lot for say next 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. I have this feeling that I don't want us to end up like in a movie like Idiocracy. I don't know if you, where in the end we lose in the long term. Again, seeking for efficiency. In the end, we end up we lose all our capabilities.
All right, thank you. And then do you want to address that question?
Yeah, that's such a thoughtful question. I feel like there might be a shift going on right now in the AI ethics community, but also in some other kind of adjacent scholarly communities where previously a lot of discussion was devoted to comparing how human decision makers will perform on some decision task in comparison to how an algorithmic system might perform on it. So one classic example is criminal recidivism risk prediction. And when we benchmark on humans there, the picture looks really horrible. People often like to cite this one empirical study that suggests that judges will be significantly more lenient once they've eaten lunch. And so that suggests to us, well, humans are incredibly capricious and fallible. And so people take away from that, well, even if our algorithmic system that we use to predict criminal recidivism risk is imperfect, which it often is, one of the paradigmatic cases of algorithmic injustice, thinking just of the Compass algorithm, if it's slightly better than our capricious judge, we should still go for that. We should deploy AI in that domain. That discussion is often very unhelpful, and I'm kind of encouraged to see lately in the community people have shifted towards this other question of how should human decision makers respond and how can we train them to respond effectively to some set of algorithmic outputs. So that can be a good strategy that can work in parallel to a non-deployment strategy, because we're not going to end up with non-deployment judgments in all domains in which that might be reasonable, right? So assume that we kind of end up in a status quo where, for whatever reason, political and economic power reasons, for instance, we've decided to deploy this really imperfect tool, and now it's up to human decision makers who interact with this technology in their domain to think about, well, should we just default to that algorithmic output, or should we actually suspend belief about what this output means and collect additional information, which may not even require AI. So that could mean engaging in other evidence-based decision-making, looking at both quantitative and qualitative findings from the social sciences to get a fuller picture of what is really going on with this algorithmic output. And so in effect, what we would do in that case is to try to counteract our own automation bias, right? We know that human decision makers are prone to over-trusting algorithmic outputs. That's the key danger here. And so I think that kind of focus would be beneficial here. So really asking, well, in domains in which we've already decided to deploy and where it's unlikely that we'll backtrack on that, what do our human decision makers need to know in order to engage effectively and in a sufficiently nuanced way with algorithmic outputs, right? And the solution there might not be just more AI, it might just be look at social science findings.
Right. Thank you so much. For those interested, Alexis...
Can I add something to that question?
Yeah, sure. For those interested, Alexis has a paper on using AI for bail's decision that goes a bit along the same lines that Annette just mentioned. So get in touch with him if you want to know more. At the end, I will give the three of you, a couple of minutes to conclude. But I see that there's another question, and we have like 5 or 6 minutes left. So go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I'm the executive director of the Coalition for the Diversity of Cultural Expressions in Canada. So I represent the cultural sector. So I'm not an ethic expert, but I was wondering, you talked a lot about regulation and regulation AI. And we've followed the work of the government in the Senate on a bill that tries to regulate broadcasting in Canada. And there's no broadcasting today without AI, of course, but in this bill, there's no mention of AI at all. We have goals. We have many goals related to cultural diversity, to minorities, linguistic minorities, indigenous people, etc. But the only mention of I find about maybe AI will be that the Commission shall not make an order under paragraph 1 that will require the use of a specific computer algorithm or source code. So that's a bill that tries to regulate, for example, Spotify and Netflix, but that says that the government will have no impact on everything that's related to algorithms. So I'm wondering, do you consider that to have goals is sufficient and the government doesn't have to act specifically on the AI? Goals are sufficient, and because we all say we don't understand that, states don't understand how it works, so it should not be their business. They should not tell businesses how to do or interfere in their business models. But can a regulation be sufficient or efficient only with goals or with ethics in the principles, but with no power on the really techniques? I don't know if it's clear.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Any reaction or comments on legislative initiatives such as the bill that was mentioned? Do you want to? Yeah?
I will say something really quickly, but I think actually the expert on this roundtable on these kinds of questions is Karina Vold. So I want to hear her opinion on this. I think it's not enough to have a lot of goals. Often that can be very bad. My favorite example of this is the EU Commission's high-level expert group on trustworthy AI, which articulated a list of, I think, 20 morally important goals that were vague and ill-defined and often in tension with each other. So it's very bad to end up with a wish list of just kind of things that are nice, you know, like justice, human rights, and the law. We're all like separate categories in this list, and it's really not easy to operationalize that, either for people in the private sector or for individual developers and so on. So that would be a bad thing. That's necessary but insufficient. Right? We need to operationalize how we actually achieve these goals.
Thank you, Annette. Karina, perhaps a few last remarks, and you can also address, since I know your work on how AI can, be part of the scaffolding for human cognition. Maybe you want to address the prior question as well.
Thanks, Joss. That was kind of you, Annette. I was thinking, I thought I was the expert on the last question, but this one I'm not so sure. Let me see. So I think I agree with what Professor Zimmermann had said about this question. So I think that it's definitely not enough just to have sort of goals that describe sort of ideal circumstances, so circumstances in which we've sort of achieved our dream list. Whether or not each sector, so it sounds like you're describing like the regulation within a particular sector, whether or not we need to have sector-specific regulation which addresses the technologies that are being used, I think is still a little unclear, or whether or not there's some regulation we can have around AI more broadly, given that it's such a cross-cutting technology and it's being used in all these different sectors. So I think it's probably going to end up being some kind of balance of both. So there's going to be some like widespread applications of AI that we just think across the board, we shouldn't be using this technology in this way. And then within specific sectors, there's probably going to emerge certain misuses. So I'm not familiar with the legislation that you're describing well enough to say like whether or not I think that would be necessary in that domain. I suspect so. So I suspect that we'll probably need a combination of both. There'll be some things that we can identify that just generally speaking should be off limits, and then other things that we need to weigh out more specifically within the domain. With respect to the other question, there's definitely, I think, in the media, a hype around discussing AI as this kind of autonomous agent. Even something like ChatGPT, is chat sentient? Can chat, be creative? I call ChatGPT just chat, by the way, just so you know, we're on a first name basis. So there's lots of questions like, what can chat do? But chat can't do anything on its own, right? Chat is totally reliant on a prompter. So some of these tools just really are not autonomous agents. They are non-autonomous tools that assist human cognition. And to assess or make claims about what they can do on their own is almost like asking a wrong question. So I think we need to find benchmarks that include the human use, because there's really no way the system doesn't really doing anything without a human prompter. Another part of that question touched on something around what are the cognitive effects of outsourcing some of our or some of our cognitive capacities to these tools? I think that is quite understudied still. So it's one thing, like I think Professor Zimmermann gave an example of, how we're using, for example, algorithmic tools to inform our decision making. So using algorithmic evidence, let's say, in some sort of prediction about somebody's likelihood of recidivism to make a judgment about their parole decisions. So that's kind of like an assisted decision making. But there's some cases where we're really outsourcing. So think about navigation, right? My niece and nephew, they don't even know how to read a map. They've completely outsourced their navigation to Google Maps without even developing it internally to begin with. They've outsourced it. Whereas somebody my age, like I learned how to navigate with paper maps. I have a good sense of that. But now I've outsourced to it. So I've developed that skill, that cognitive skill of navigation already, and now outsourced it. It's unclear what set of core cognitive skills we need before we can start outsourcing them. So there might be a sort of set that we want to develop internally first, like mathematics, logical thinking, certain kinds of metacognition or self-awareness around decision making.
things like that. Whereas if we start outsourcing it too soon, it's just not clear yet what the cognitive downstream effects might be, I think.
Thanks so much for that, Karina. It's all the more important that ChatGPT is awful at logical reasoning. You know, it cannot do it. Vincent, perhaps a few last words?
I think Karina has covered this ground pretty well already. Maybe just one small thing that I want to add also to the person who asked the question. They asked about cognitive capacities and how these would change. That's obviously one question. But there is, generally speaking, a larger question of how our perception of the world or interaction with the world and self-perception changes. Right? It could be in subtle ways or in not so subtle ways that we change because we're using these devices. And that is clearly happening to some extent, and it would be good for us to watch it a little bit. And in some cases control it. I mean, what smartphones have been doing to our social life is ambiguous, I suppose, right?
All right, so we're already past our time, so let me thank the three of you one more time. Annette, Vincent, and Karina, thank you so much for your generous participation to our reflection and discussion.